Hello, everyone. Welcome to U.S. Institute of Peace. We're very glad to have a very special day discussing U.S. and North Korea relations as well as South Korea relations. As you know, many of you may know, may not know, U.S. Institute of Peace was founded in 1984, and it was founded by U.S. Congress. So it is a completely nonpartisan effort to build peace around the world. And so today we're very happy to have an event that with Sejong Institute in Korea, as well as we are also taking advantage of Minister Kim, Minister of Unifications in Korea. We've just had a couple of hours of discussions, and we're continuing those discussions. And so to start with, I would like to invite Baek Jong-chan, Chancellor of Sejong Institute. It's a joint program to provide some opening remarks. And then I will invite Minister Kim for his remarks. After those, there will be some Q's and A's, and then we'll move to a first panel immediately after that. Thank you very much. Dr. Baek?
네, 방금 소개받은 백종차입니다. 존경하는 앰베서더 조셉 윤 and Dr. Frank Ohm 그리고
Okay. So President Nancy Lindborg, Mr. Joseph Yoon, Minister Kim, and distinguished guests and experts from the U.S. and Korea, especially Unification Minister Kim Yong-Chul, and on behalf of the President Baek Hak-sun and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, as the chairman of the Sejong Institute, I would like to express my deep gratitude, and I'm honored to be speaking at the U.S. Institute of Peace. This morning, we already discussed North Korean nuclear issues and other U.S.-Korean issues as well. And during the past year, I was able to have many discussions with scholars here in the United States. But issue of the Korean Peninsula, and especially the nuclear issue, is one that everyone has their own personal theory about, and all experts have their own ideas about how to resolve the Korean Peninsula and nuclear issue. I respect them, and I hope that they will all continue their research in this manner. However, rather than talking in a scholarly manner, I want to talk realistically about what should happen before the end of the year. We only have 1.5 months left. Chairman Kim Jong-un has already set this deadline at the end of the year and saying that there needs to be some change after this deadline. As a Korean, I believe that this deadline is very worrisome. The Korean regime that I know and the leaders that I know, once they say something, they actually take action, regardless of whether we like it or not. So if the end of this year passes without any action, I think that something bad will happen. And so many experts have talked in the past, and there are many theories about why practitioner talks did not succeed. But all the ideas up to now, all the contents of the discussions needs to be integrated so that in the next 1.5 months, when North Korea and the US meet again, so in what way should we meet, or who should meet, which practitioners? We need to be in agreement on this. And in this morning, we talked about how to bring North Korea to the negotiating table. The U.S. is a country that loves peace more than anyone in this world. And the Koreans believe that Americans are such. And so we hope that the American government will try to find a solution from the point of view of a smaller nation. So this is something that I would like to talk about or hear about more about in the afternoon sessions. And for the rest of the discussions, I hope that this can be an unraveling point to the North Korea nuclear issue. And real expectations for peace on the Korean Peninsula can proceed forward. I hope that 2020 will be such a year when these citizens and experts of the United States will help us to do this. So I would like to end my remarks with this sentence. Thank you.
Of security and strategic studies in Korea, and I knew him when he was the National Security Advisor some 12, 14 years ago. It's good to see you here. Next, I would like to introduce Unification Minister Kim Yong-Chul. In fact, I met him about 6-7 months ago when he was still the head of Korea Institute of National Unification, KINU. And it was at that time we talked about doing a program like this in USIP, and we talked about, actually it's a forthcoming study from US Institute of Peace on peace regime on Korean Peninsula. So actually that study was very much inspired by Minister Kim, and I'm very happy that he got a big promotion. He's a minister, and Minister, please come on up. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I am Kim Yong-Chul, Minister of Unification for the Republic of Korea. I would like to extend a sincere welcome to all of you who have come to the Korea Global Forum's U.S. seminar. I'd like to express my many thanks to Jung-Chun Baek, Chairman of the Sejong Institute, and Ambassador Joseph Yoon of the United States Institute of Peace, and to all distinguished guests. Cooperation between South Korea and the U.S. being more important now than ever, I am conscious of the significance of directly explaining the South Korean government's policy on North Korea to America's top experts on the Korean Peninsula. I thank you all for the interest and affection you bring to bear on the Korean Peninsula, and I look forward to a substantial discussion that can light the way ahead on that path to peace, which South Korea and the United States have been traveling together. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the state of affairs on the Korean Peninsula is now at an important turning point. On October 5th, working levels talks in Stockholm restarted the clock of dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea that had come to a stop after the Hanoi summit of last February. Although an agreement was not reached, the spark of dialogue has not gone out. North Korea has repeatedly emphasized the deep trust that exists between both countries' leaders, while emphasizing the end of the year as the deadline for negotiations. The United States, too, with a stronger will than ever, is making the utmost effort to solve the problem at hand. This is a precious opportunity for the United States, for North Korea, and most of all, for South Korea. We cannot let this opportunity pass, because it will not come again. The solution to bringing about real progress in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula is not as far off as one might think. From past history, we already know that changes in relations are at the core of a solution to issues related to the Korean Peninsula. There may be many relevant actors, but the most important thing is the organic relationship between the three actors, South Korea, North Korea, and the United States. When these three bilateral relationships between the two Koreas, North Korea and U.S., and between South Korea and U.S., have been in step with each other, thereby creating a virtuous cycle, there have been progress in the Korean Peninsula too. The experiences of the last year are a case in point. Dialogue between the two Koreas heightened North Korea's will to denuclearize and improve relations with the U.S. In a virtuous cycle, this led to talks between U.S. and North Korea and to concrete measures. A new transformation of this triangular relationship is needed in the current standstill so that the resolution of issues related to the Korean Peninsula can regain momentum and make progress. Last September, at a summit held on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, the leaders of the United States and South Korea affirmed the need to transform the relations between the two Koreas, as well as the relationship between North Korea and the United States. On this occasion, I'd like to discuss the direction that triangular relations between the U.S. and the two Koreas should take, while focusing on each of these three bilateral relations in turn. First of all, the times for a bolder transformation of inter-Korean relations. Since the truce of 1953, inter-Korean relations have repeatedly stopped and started, moving alternately towards peace and war, towards understanding and misunderstanding, towards the future and the past. Last year, dazzling and unprecedented results were achieved. But as progress slowed in denuclearization talks, we have again entered a state of lull. The road ahead for inter-Korean relations remains a long one, and there are many issues that need to be resolved. Most urgent of all is the need to address the greatest tragedy of division, namely the problem of separated families. Of the 133,000 members of separated families who have applied to the South Korean government for family reunions, some 60% have already passed away. The surviving 53,000 applicants are reaching an average age of 81 years. Their simple but desperate hopes are to confirm whether family members are alive or dead, or at least travel to the vicinity of their home region before any more time is lost. We have to enable these people to meet their families before their death. This urgent humanitarian problem must take precedence before any political considerations. The South Korean government is also aware that members of some separated families reside in the United States. Recently, while expressing condolences in regard to the passing of President Moon Jae-in's mother, President Trump indicated an interest in the issue of separated families. South and North Korea have already agreed to open a permanent meeting place as part of a fundamental solution to the problem of separated families. The South Korean government is doing its utmost for the speedy implementation of this agreement. The South Korean government also bears the responsibility to solve a variety of other problems that have arisen as a result of division. This is a duty stipulated by our Constitution and our legislation. Moreover, the inter-Korean relationship can achieve harmony with the shared American and South Korean goal of denuclearized peninsula and a peace system, and become a useful route for encouraging North Korea to make the right choices. So far, it has been our historical experience that when relations are good between the two Koreas, North Korean nuclear threat lessens. Last year, we saw directly that by leading the way, inter-Korean relationship ushered in the improvement of relations between North Korea and the U.S., as well as the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Furthermore, the implementation of measures for the relaxation of military tensions that were agreed to in the Pyongyang Joint Declaration of 2018 have dramatically reduced the danger of accidental military clashes and created favorable conditions for denuclearization talks. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the establishment of a permanent peace are important concerns for the United States, but they're the most important concerns of all to South Korea, whose future and fate depend on them. The South Korean government is constantly exploring plans for the development of an inter-Korean relationship that can contribute to the improvement of relations between U.S. and North Korea, as well as to progress in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. It's true that various external conditions greatly limit the room within which inter-Korean relations can operate, but there certainly exist roles that the inter-Korean relationship must play in the process of building peace on the peninsula. If the inter-Korean relationship is tight and bound, relations between the U.S. and North Korea will also have a hard time progressing beyond a certain level. At this point, the important thing is for leaders of the two Koreas to implement carefully the items agreed to in last year's summits of Panmunjom and Pyongyang. Recently, North Korea approached the South Korean government and relevant business operators with a demand for removal of decrepit facilities from Mount Kumgang, which it intends to make into an international tourist area. At the same time, however, North Korea made it clear that removal would proceed through consultation and that South Korean citizens would also be welcome at Mount Kumgang. In the 10 years after the first cruise ship left harbor in 1998, 1,930,000 South Korean citizens visited the Kumgang Mountains, making them a symbol of inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, and a place in which citizens of North and South Korea could meet and interact. Last year, the leaders of South and North Korea agreed on a plan to normalize tourist operations in the Kumgang Mountains when conditions are prepared. It has been the consistent position of the South Korean government that all problems pertaining to inter-Korean relations must be solved through dialogue and consultation. This holds true for the issue of Mount Kumgang tourism as well. Once the two Koreas sit face to face, a creative, implementable solution can be found that satisfies both sides. The South Korean government regards the current situation not as a crisis for Mount Kumgang tourism, but as an opportunity to prepare the foundation for sustainable inter-Korean exchange and cooperation. Keeping in mind the changed conditions and environment, the South Korean government will actively push for the resumption and vitalization of Mount Kumgang tourism through consultation with North Korea. Expanding the scope of cooperation, a joint inter-Korean tourist area will be created along part of the East Sea coast, and inter-Korean human exchanges will be vitalized in accordance with the agreement reached by North and South Korea, South and North Korea and the Pyongyang Joint Declaration. In addition, President Moon proposed in his speech at the UN General Assembly that the DMZ will be turned into an international peace zone. If the DMZ that cuts across the center of the Korean Peninsula can become an arena for cooperation between North and South Korea and the international community, the danger of military clashes will be conspicuously reduced. The DMZ will serve as a stabilizing institution that drives the denuclearization process. Apart from this, there are endless potential areas of cooperation that can be realized right away with benefit to both Koreas, should North Korea respond favorably.
There are roles to be played by every nation in the trilateral relationship. The South Korean government will actively seek out and expand such spaces of sustainable inter-Korean cooperation. The aim is to offer real-world proof that the inner peace can be expanded outward. A transformational relations between the U.S. and North Korea must be achieved. Both parties had already come to an agreement in Singapore regarding the ultimate goal of denuclearization. It was agreed to exchange the complete denuclearization of North Korea for a guarantee of the security of the North Korean regime. This agreement is still in effect. The current task is for the two parties to agree on the order in which they implement their sides. This is related to the level of trust between North Korea and the U.S. Both countries have maintained hostile relations for over 70 years. The ocean of mistrust is not easy to traverse in one attempt. The reason is that the North Korea and the U.S. must improve their understanding of each other and carefully build trust through dialogue and negotiations. It is to be hoped that follow-up talks begin as soon as possible so that the momentum of negotiations is not lost. Dialogue is the only solution. In addition, creative plans for building early trust between the two sides must be explored. In this regards, attention should be paid to the three principles for resolving issues related to the Korean Peninsula that President Moon had proposed early this year at the UN General Assembly. Those three factors or the principles are zero tolerance for war, a mutual security guarantee, and co-prosperity. Zero tolerance for war means that the firm principle of solving issues related to the Korean Peninsula in a peaceful manner. The truce regime of a Korean Peninsula under a passive peace must be converted to a permanent peace regime in which war cannot break out again. This will be a benefit to America and the entire international community. A mutual security guarantee means creating the security environment in which North Korea can concentrate on denuclearization measures. Chairman Kim Jong-un must be guided in such a way that he continues on the current road and does not abandon the will to do away with the nuclear weapons. While talks are in progress to those ends, both sides must refrain from all hostile actions. Last year, the decision to postpone joint military exercise between South Korea and the U.S. created positive conditions for progress in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. The co-prosperity means a virtuous cycle for peace and the economy. When peace yields practical benefits to the parties maintaining it, the building of an even firmer peace becomes possible. By encouraging North Korea to choose economy and prosperity instead of nuclear weapons, denuclearization can be driven forward and military tensions reduced. The relaxation of sanctions on North Korea will accelerate denuclearization and the building of peace on the Korean Peninsula. But at what stage and in what scope sanctions are to be relaxed is a question that remains to be answered. A more flexible and creative approach is possible. The inter-Korean relationship can also be an important strategic instrument. By expanding the realm of inter-Korean cooperation, ways can be found in which to provide sufficient inducement to North Korea without arousing the concern of the international community. Considering North Korea's emphasis on the end of the year as a deadline, there is a high possibility that one or two opportunities will present themselves before then. The important thing to remember is that once we lose this opportunity, we do not know when the next one will be. The opportunities of the present must be used to the full effect and not squandered. The experience of past failures can serve as a good lesson. It is difficult to build trust while maintaining hostile policies. The time has come for the North Korea and the U.S. to end their long history of hostile relations. For the Korean peace process to become more effective, we have to have a strong relationship between the U.S. and Korea. For the past six years, the alliance between South Korea and the U.S. has played a key role and rendered important services in keeping peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Last year, in particular, close cooperation between South Korea and the U.S. allowed for a much stronger stance towards North Korea. We must now move forward and firmly consolidate peace on the Korean Peninsula on the basis of the results achieved during that time. The 4 points set out by the U.S. and North Korea in the Singapore Agreement are milestones showing the way forward for peace process on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. and Korea must join forces so that progress is achieved in each of those 4 pillars. To those ends, both inter-Korean relations and relations between North Korea and the U.S. must be transformed. A virtuous cycle in the tripartite relationship between North and South Korea and the U.S. must be brought about. with North and South Korea staking out a space for sustainable cooperation, and North Korea and the U.S. carefully building trust between them. We have a common purpose. We have worked together. We have combined wisdom, overcoming adversities. The history of the alliance between South Korea and the U.S. is one of growth upon growth in an ever-changing environment. In the future, too, South Korea and the U.S. will continue to serve the peace and stability of Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia while constantly adjusting and fine-tuning their roles. I appreciate your time today, and thank you.
These things on? Okay, they are on, I guess. We go into Q's and A's, and thank you for your remarks. I especially liked how you set the relationship between North and South, between North Korea and US, and of course between South Korea and US. Maybe if I can take advantage of being the moderator and ask the first question. Of course, you are Minister of Unification, but I didn't hear anything about unification in your remarks. What is the goal of the Moon administration and yourself in general in your approach to unification?
예, 장관님, 먼저 기조연설을 통해서 좋은 말씀을 해주신 데 대한 감사의 말씀을 전해드리고 싶습니다. 장관님께서 기조연설을 하시는 와중에 남북관계, 북미관계, 그리고 한미강제를 다시 한번 강조해 주셨는데요. 제가 이제 사회자인 만큼 첫 질문을 좀 드리도록 하겠습니다. 통일부 장관으로서 이제 통일에 대해서는 기조연설에서 말씀을 안 하셨던 것 같습니다. 그렇다면 문재인 정부와 이제 장관님 그리고 통일부는 지금 현재 어떠한 목적을 가지고 남북관계를 발전시켜 나가기 위해서 노력하고 계신지 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 한국 내부에서 이 통일 개념에 대한 다양한 의견 차이가 있습니다. 특히 세대 간의 차이가 있는 것 같습니다. 우리 이 분단 1세대는 통일이라는 것을 일민족, 일국가, 일체제로 다시 합친다라는 것을 의미합니다. 그렇지만 젊은 세대는 이 통일이라는 것이 자신의 일상적 삶에 어떤 이익을 줄 것인가 하는 것을 매우 중시하고 그렇기 때문에 좀 더 장기적이고 점진적이고 단계적인 통일을 선호합니다.
So in the case of Republic of Korea, we have a lot of different concepts of unification among the people. I think there is a generation gap and how people see the unification. The first generation of the people who have experienced the separation of a country believes that the unification should come as a one nation, one system, and a one country. However, the younger generation of our people believes in different things. They believe that it is important for the unification to bring benefit to their day-to-day lives. Therefore, they want to have a gradual and long-term approach for a unification process.
그래서 정부의 공식적인 통일 방안은 단계적인 접근이다 이렇게 볼 수가 있을 것 같고요. 한국 사회 내부적으로는 통일에 앞서서 평화라는 것이 매우 중요하고 남북 간의 차이들을 점진적으로 해소해 나가면서 공존과 공동 번영을 하는 것이 매우 중요하다라는 컨센서스가 있습니다.
So therefore, the official plan and the stance of the Korean government is to have a step-by-step approach for unification of two Koreas. And among the Korean people, the peace is something that must be achieved first before we move on to a discussion on the unification issue. And at the same time, we will have to constantly put an effort to reduce the gap between two Koreas. So we will try to create a Korean Peninsula where the two Koreas can coexist and enjoy the prosperity that will come through the inter-Korean cooperations.
Well, thank you for that response. Can we open it up to questions from the floor? Maybe I will stand up so I can see a little better. Okay. So we have one there, and then we'll go up this way and come down that way. Okay. Yeah.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I think it's strange that we're offering security guarantees to a regime that's killed 1.2 million human beings. That's 6 atomic bombs worth of dead bodies. Can you help me understand why this makes any sense? And why would we trade just nuclear weapons for those guarantees and not a closure of the prison camps? Raise the price, raise the stakes, actually save some real lives.
Okay, to save time, let's go up to the next one so we can do 2 by 2.
Stanley Kober. 2 news items from yesterday. One, as I'm sure everybody is aware, our negotiator walked out of the negotiations with South Korea on the military spending issue. The second item, we talk about a pivot to Asia. But I read 3 weeks ago, all our aircraft carriers on the East Coast are in Norfolk. We sent an aircraft carrier into the Persian Gulf yesterday. It's been on deployment for 7 months. We have other commitments. For all the talk about moving to Asia, we are stuck in the Middle East. For both these reasons, what is the future of the US-ROK alliance?
Go ahead.
예, 질문을 좀 정리해서 말씀드리겠습니다. 먼저 북한에 대한 이제 안전 보장에 대해서 이야기를 하고 있는데, 북한의 경우는 약 120만 명의 군인을 보유하고 있고 이제 핵무기 등을 보유하고 있는 국가입니다. 따라서 이런 국가에 대한 안전 보장에 대해서 이제 실질적으로 어떠한 이제 이득이 있을지가 좀 궁금합니다. 특히나 북한 같은 경우는 이제 정치범 소형소 등 인권 등에 대한 심각한 문제가 지금에도 일어나고 있는 상황에서 이제 실질적으로 사람의 목숨을 구하는 것이 중요하지 않을까 싶습니다. 이에 대한 장관님의 의견을 좀 듣고 싶습니다. 이제 두 번째 질문은, 첫 번째로 지금 어제 방위비 분담 협상 과정에서 이제 미국 협상가들이 이제 협상장을 박치고 나왔다는 이제 이야기가 있었습니다. 두 번째로는 이제 아시아 지역과 이제 중동에 이제 미국의 항공모함들이 예전에 배치가 되어 있었는데, 이제 중동 지역에 대한 이제 집중을 미국이 상대적으로 올리면서 이제 아시아 지역에 대한 중요도가 이제 어느 정도 조정이 될 수도 있을 것이라 생각이 됩니다. 이러한 상황에서 이제 한미 동맹의 미래는 어떻게 될 것인지 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
I'm happy he's answering them, not me.
예, 첫 번째 질문에 대해서 답변을 드리겠습니다. 안전보장이라는 것은 말 그대로 이 시큐리티 개런티라는 것은 지금 현재 비핵화 협상에서 주로 초점을 맞추고 있는 부분은 북한이 핵무기를 포기할 수 있는 환경을 어떻게 제공할 것인가라는 것입니다. 단기적으로 보면은 북한은 한미 군사훈련의 중단을 요구하고 있고, 장기적으로 보면은 종전선언과 또 한반도 평화체제라고 를 요구를 하고 있습니다. 이런 부분들은 뭐 조세균 대사님도 잘 아시겠지만은 한반도 평화 체제에 대한 논의의 역사는 매우 깁니다. 지난 20-30년 정도 사이에 이 한반도 평화 체제를 어떻게 만들어 나갈 것인가, 또 단계적으로 각각의 로드맵에 대한 많은 구상들이 있습니다.
So regarding the security guarantee, the focus of the security guarantee at this point is to create a room for North Korea and set a condition for North Korea to go for the denuclearization process. And if you look into this in more detail, in short term, North Korea is demanding that the ROK-US combined military exercises should be stopped. And in the long term, they're demanding that there must be an end of war declaration and the establishment of the peace regime. As Ambassador Yoon is well aware of, the discussion that we had regarding the peace regime has a long history. So we had 2 to 3 decades of discussion that we had throughout the globe regarding how to establish a peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. So we are constantly trying to devise a step-by-step approach in different sectors to establish peace regime.
물론 이 과정에서 북한 인권 문제의 실질적인 개선도 매우 중요하다고 생각합니다. 한국 정부도 북한 인권 문제의 개선이 중요하다라는 점에 대해서는 공감을 하고 있습니다. 다만 이 접근 방법과 관련돼서는 남북 관계에 또 특수성이 있기 때문에 여러 가지 차원에서 그야말로 자유권과 또 사회권과 국제사회가 얘기하는 인권의 포괄적 측면들이 그야말로 실질적으로 하나하나 개선할 수 있는 방안들을 찾아가고 있다는 점도 강조하고 싶습니다. 두 번째, 방위비 분담금 문제, 또 지소미아 문제, 사실 지금 한반도를 둘러싸고 한미 간에 여러 가지 어려운 의제들이 있습니다. 이런 의제들이 북핵 협상의 그야말로 집중도를 약화시키지 않을까라는 걱정들도 있습니다. 방위비 분담금 협상에 대해서 제가 구체적으로 말씀드리기는 어려울 것 같지만은 제가 아까도 강조했지만 한미 동맹이 지나온 길들을 보면은 아주 예민하고 민감한 문제들을 또 슬기롭게 극복한 경험들이 있습니다. 이번 사안들도 잘 극복해 나가면서 한미 동맹이 정말 지속 가능한 동맹으로서 거듭날 수 있는 또 기회가 되지 않을까라는 생각도 듭니다.
In this process of implementing the peace regime in the Korean Peninsula, the Korean government is trying to improve the North Korean human rights issue as well. So we're trying to devise an appropriate approach to improve the human rights issue that is going through in North Korea. However, we have to understand there are some unique characteristics in inter-Korean relations. And within this context, we will try our best to improve the freedom of the people in North Korea, as well as the social rights and other internationally recognized important human rights that concerns that North Korea is going through. And regarding the second question on the ROK-US alliance, I think I'm not in the right position to talk about the cost-sharing decisions as well as the negotiation that is going on at this point. However, even if we're going through these difficult negotiations like the cost-sharing issue as well as GSOMIA, I think the ROK and the US alliance will try to bring wisdom together to resolve this issue. However, my concern is that these kind of issues between two countries might reduce the focus and the concentration on the denuclearization negotiation. So I sincerely hope that the alliance can bring wisdoms together to overcome given challenge. And once we overcome this challenge, we'll be able to establish a sustainable cooperation between the two countries.
Thank you. Let's go to our friend David there. Not just because he's our friend, but Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Minister, thank you for your remarks. All Americans and all Koreans share the same values: freedom, individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights. And I think that in your position, I'd like to emphasize, I really don't think we're going to see an end to the nuclear program or the crimes against humanity being committed in the North until there is a secure, stable, liberal, democratic government determined by the Korean people that might be called a United Republic of Korea. When we see that, I think then we'll see an end to the nuclear program and the human rights issues. My two questions are, how do you think that the United States and South Korea should work together towards what you have presented as a very unique human rights situation in the North? Kim Jong-un denies the human rights of Korean people in the North in order to remain in power. And second, is what kind of support from the United States would you like toward unification and toward achieving Korean unification? How should the United States support that? The last three presidents of both Korea and the United States have all said peaceful unification is a goal. And even President Trump and President Moon on June 30th, 2017 said that South Korea will take the lead in establishing the conditions for peaceful unification. So how would you like the United States to support the unification process?
예, 장관님 좋은 말씀 감사합니다. 미국은 어떻게 보면은 이제 자유와 이제 민주주의 그리고 시장 경제 체제의 기반으로 이제 자유로운 국가로 이제 발전해 나가고 있었지만 저희가 북한을 보았을 때는 인권 문제뿐만이 아니라 이제 핵 문제 그리고 이제 다양한 비인륜적 문제들이 지속적으로 발생하는 국가라고 생각이 됩니다. 저는 개인적으로 생각하는 것이 이러한 문제들이 이제 근본적으로 해결되기 위해서는 이제 북한에도 자유민주주의와 시장 경제 체제 등이 도입이 되어야 된다고 생각합니다. 이러한 과정에서 대한민국 정부도 이제 상당히 많은 노력을 해야 될 것이고 이제 북한을 한국처럼 바꾸지 않고서는 이러한 문제들의 해결이 어렵다고 생각이 됩니다. 그렇다면 이 과정에서 이제 한국과 미국은 다양한 협력을 진행하고 있습니다. 북한의 인권 문제 관련해서는 이제 김정은 위원장이 지속적으로 이러한 문제들을 외면하고 있고 이를 통해서 정권 유지하고 있는 상황입니다. 이 과정에서 이제 어떻게 이러한 문제를 해결할 수 있을 것이라 생각이 되시는지요? 두 번째는 이제 한미 동맹 관계 그리고 이제 미국의 지원이 다양한 분야에서 있을 수 있겠으나 이제 한반도의 통일을 위해서 이제 미국이 어떠한 역할을 수행할 수 있을지 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 특히나 이제 문재인 대통령과 트럼프 대통령께서 정상회담을 하는 과정에서도 이제 한반도의 평화 통일을 위해서 이제 미국이 다양한 지원을 하겠다라는 말씀을 하셨던 것 같습니다. 이 과정에서 미국의 역할이 어떤 것이 있을지 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
예, 먼저 북한의 변화와 관련돼서는 한꺼번에 모든 것을 미국이 원하는 또 한국이 원하는 그런 것을 이루기는 쉽지 않을 거라고 생각을 합니다. 이 변화를 어떻게 변화가 가능할 수 있는 환경들을 조건들을 어떻게 만들어 나갈 것인가 하는 것인데요. 한국의 입장에서 북한의 변화와 관련돼서는 정부마다 약간의 정책의 차이들이 있지만은 문재인 정부는 기본적으로 접촉을 통한 변화라는 개념에 입각해 있습니다. 아시다시피 서로 접촉을 하면서 관계를 맺어나가면서 변화들을 가져나가는 것이 바람직하다라고 생각을 하고 있습니다.
So first of all, if we want to bring change to North Korea, we cannot bring every change that we want at once. Therefore, we should constantly try to set condition and shape the environment for North Korea to make a gradual change. And in different administration in the Republic of Korea, we might have a little different approach toward North Korea. However, the approach that we have from Moon Jae-in administration is that we want to bring change in North Korea through the contact and the engagement. So as you know, the contact as well as the engagement toward North Korea will create a room for us to establish a new relations with the North Korea, which will make gradual changes to that country.
예, 그리고 두 번째 질문은 현재 북한의 비핵화를 이루어 나가는 과정에서 한미 간에 협력해야 될 부분들에 대해서는 제가 아까 강조를 했습니다. 그리고 더 나아가서는 평화로운 한반도라는 미래의 상황에서 한미동맹의 역할과 기능에 대해서도 지금부터 준비를 해나가야 되지 않을까라는 생각이 드는데 그 문제와 관련돼서는 한미 양국의 전문가들이 이미 논의를 시작을 했습니다. 특히 이 평화연구소하고 또 한국의 전문가들이 그런 논의들을 통해서 중장기적으로 지속 가능한 동북아시아와 한반도에서의 한미동맹의 역할에 대해서 좋은 방안들을 마련할 것으로 믿고 있습니다.
So regarding your second question, I think there is a lot of cooperations that can happen between Korea and United States for a denuclearization process, as I mentioned before. But regarding the peaceful unification as well as peace in the region, assuming that we have established peace in the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, I think there will be a lot of adjustment in the role and the function of the ROK-US alliance. And then many of the experts in Korea and the United States started devising plans for the future of the ROK-US alliance. Also, we have a USIP here, which is working very closely with the Korean experts to devise mid to long-term plan to establish a sustainable cooperation mechanism between the alliance so that we can contribute to peace and the stability of the Korean Peninsula as well as in Northeast Asia.
I think we have time for just very few more questions, okay? Let's take last two. One there, right at the back, yeah. And we'll take both together.
장관님 안녕하세요. 보이스 오브 아메리카의 김영경 기자라고 합니다. 이번에 한국 정부가 탈북민 2명을 북한으로 되돌려보낸 것에 대해서 국제사회에서 우려의 목소리가 나오고 있습니다. 16명을 살해한 혐의가 있다고 해도 한국 내에서 재판을 받아야 하는 게 맞지 않았냐. 그게 국내법에도 맞고 국제법에도 맞다는 그런 지적이 나오고 있는데요. 대한민국 정부의 좀 정확한 입장을 설명해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
We'll take the second question too, yeah.
네, 반갑습니다. 저는 미국 자유아시아 방송의 이상민 기자라고 합니다. 방금 전 말씀하실 때 미국 간의 초기 신뢰 구축을 위해 필요한 창의적인 방안을 말씀하셨는데요. 그중에 세 번째가 공동 번영을 언급하시면서 대북 제재 완화를 말씀하셨습니다. 그러면서 그 대북 제재 완화를 위해서는 어느 단계에서 어느 범위에서 할지가 중요한 쟁점이고 이에 대한 그 창의적인 방법이 필요하다고 말씀하셨는데요. 미국 같은 경우는 북한의 실질적인 비핵화 조치 있기 전까지는 대북 제재가 없다는 그런 입장인데 지금 한국 측에서 말씀하시는 이런 창의적 방법이 어떤 건지 대북 제재 관련해서 말씀 감사하겠습니다.
So the first question that was raised was that recently there has been a case where the Korean government returned and deported 2 North Korean residents who have came to South Korea after murdering 16 people, and there is a concern from the international society that these individuals should have been tried within the South Korean court and then be punished if there was any kind of misconduct that they have committed. So in this regard, we'd like to hear Minister's opinion regarding why such cases has been dealt in such manner within South Korea. And the second question is the confidence-building measure between Korea as well as the United States. So the minister has mentioned that there will be a creative measure to build prosperity in the region. And one of the things that he mentioned is that there might be a consideration of a partial sanction relief against North Korea to establish confidence between the parties involved. So in that sense, the creativity here might be the scale of the sanction relief and the process of how the sanction relief might take place. However, the United States stance is that the US government will not relieve sanctions against North Korea unless there is a serious effort for denuclearization. So in that sense, we would like to hear Minister's opinion on what kind of creative measures can be implemented in this procedure to get a sanction relief and achieve a co-prosperity in the region.
네, 첫 번째 질문에 대해서 답변을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 북한 어선에서 16명을 살해했다라는 첩보를 입수했습니다. 그리고 그 어선이 NLL 북방 한계선 근처에 왔습니다. 그 북한 어선은 바로 기술을 한 것이 아니고 이틀 정도 계속해서 도망을 갔습니다. 그래서 북방 한계선 근처에 통상적으로 우리 해군이 처리하는 방식들이 있는데 그래서 우리 해군 특공대가 가서 납포를 했습니다. 그리고 나서 2명을 분리신문을 했습니다. 그 부분에 대해서는 강요를 한 것이 아니고 그야말로 각자가 범행의 과정을 아주 상세하게 진술을 했습니다. 그런 상황에서 한국 정부는 어떤 선택을 할 것인가 하는 부분들인데요. 저희들이 통상적으로 동해에서 이 북한 어민들이 표류하거나 또는 기순하거나 다양한 사례들이 있습니다. 그때 원칙은 무엇이냐면은 기순 의사가 정확할 때, 기순 의사라는 것은 출발부터 동기와 또 의도, 준비 과정, 또 도피 과정 이런 것들을 종합적으로 판단합니다. 근데 이번 같은 경우에는 기순 의사의 진정성을 수용하기는 어려웠다라는 것이고, 기순 의사를 밝혔다기보다는 물론 기순 의사를 밝혔지만은 그것이 일종의 범행에 대한 도피 목적으로 해석을 했습니다.
So regarding the two deported North Korean residents who have killed 16 people in the fishing vote, so we received an intel brief and the report stating that these individuals have committed such a crime, and then they were using this fishing vote to approach the NLL. And when they approached the NLL, they have not come to the South Korean part of the NLL, but ran away from our inspections for a couple days. And after the ROK Navy seized these individuals, we went through this joint investigation and interrogation process. So we put these individuals in two separate rooms for interrogation. And during the time, they have confessed the murdering of the 16 individuals, and they had a very detailed explanation. So therefore, we thought the crime that they've committed has something that we can trust. And then later on, when these individuals have completed their interrogation process, the Korean government had to make a decision. So usually, when North Korean fishing vessel crosses the NLL, comes to the East Sea of South Korea, there's two different cases. One is an accidental approach to South Korea's sea, and the second one is that there are some people who want to defect from North Korea and uses the boat to come to the South Korean side. And during the time when we have an interrogation of these individuals, we will ask their will for defection. And there are some fishermen who want to return to their country, and there are some people who want to stay in South Korea. And when we evaluate the will that they have, we have a comprehensive review process to check the sincerity of their will. We will go through their preparation settings as well as the will and all the kind of things that these individuals say during the interrogation and make a decision to protect these individuals under South Korean law or return them to North Korea. So in this case, when these two fishermen were coming to South Korea, they initially did not have a will to come to South Korea, but they were trying to run away from the crime that they have committed. That is why in this particular case, we made a decision to deport them and send them back to North Korea.
참고로 말씀을 드리면은 지난 10년간 북한 어민들 중에서 기술을 한 사람들은 받아들였지만은 다시 돌아가겠다고 한 사람들은 돌려보냈습니다. 지난 10년간 그 숫자는 185명입니다. 그리고 국제법적으로 국제법에서의 난민 규약이라든가 또 국내법의 난민법도 있지만은 이러한 전적인 국제 규범으로 보면은 이 비정치적 살인은 보호 대상이 아니다라고 알고 있습니다.
So for the past decade, there were a number of cases where the fishermen wanted to come to South Korea, and there were some fishermen who wanted to return to their home country. So we've returned 185 North Korean residents who had a will to return to their country. And also there's a lot of international conventions, including the refugee conventions that were set by the United Nations, as well as there's domestic law concerning the refugees coming to South Korea. And within this refugee convention, there is a clause stating that the murder that was caused with a non-political intent is not something that we can protect. There is a way to not protect individuals who have committed a murder without having a political intent. So therefore, we had to make a decision to return them to North Korea.
그리고 두 번째 질문과 관련돼서는 물론 지금 현재 북한과 미국의 협상 과정에서 제재 완화의 시점과 또 수준 이런 부분들은 매우 중요한 협상의 의제입니다. 하노이 회담 이후 북한과 미국은 여러 의제에서 차이점을 줄여나가고 있지만 여전히 차이를 보이고 있는 부분들은 제재 문제를 둘러싼 차이라고 생각을 합니다. 그렇지만 여러분들이 하노이 회담 과정에서도 논의되었던 스냅백 방식이라든가 다양한 또 기술적인 방안들이 있지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 이런 부분들은 또 북한과 미국이 실무 협상을 통해서 차이를 줄여나가는 과정이 필요하지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다.
And regarding the sanction relief that will be negotiated between North Korea and the United States, I guess the biggest issue surrounding the sanction relief is the scale as well as the timeline of when the sanction relief will happen. So in this case, there were particular discussion that did took place in Hanoi, and then during this discussion in Hanoi, there were a lot of issues that were discussed, and then the United States and the North Korea were able to find out that there was a huge gap between these two countries. And the biggest gap, I guess, would be the concept of sanction relief that these two countries had. And one of the options that were discussed was snapback. And I think there's other technical issues that can be discussed to be between the two countries to be applied for the partial sanction relief issues. And therefore, it is important for the North Korea and the United States to come together during the working level discussions to try to reduce the gap and try to find a way to resolve this issue.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give the minister a big round of applause, okay? Thank you. And then I understand that the next session starts immediately, so you're going to have to wait for a break, okay?
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Apologize for the lack of break between the previous session and this one, but there is a break after this short 1 hour session, so that'll be a good time for to use the bathroom if you need to. So welcome to this first session. My name is Frank Om. I run the North Korea program here at USIP, and this session is on denuclearization and a peace regime for the Korean Peninsula. I was hoping that we'd be in a more positive situation than we are today. basically since the first summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim in Singapore in June 2018, the two sides have not been able to find common ground on denuclearization steps as well as sanctions relief and other corresponding measures. Today we're just over a month away from the end of the year deadline that North Korea has set. So I think North Korea has also refused to re-engage with the U.S. Both at the working level as well as at the leader level until the U.S. indicates a willingness to offer more flexibility on denuclearization, on sanctions relief and security guarantees. So the two main questions we have before us today is what are the prospects for any sort of agreement before the end of the year? And two, if there is no agreement, what does it mean for tensions on the peninsula and for inter-Korean peace-building measures? We have an excellent panel here today who will share their thoughts and insights on these questions. I'll give them about 7 minutes or so to speak, and then we can open up for a discussion with the audience. And let me quickly introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak. First, we have Dr. Yong-Chul, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Yong-Chul University. He also serves as an advisor to the Ministry of Unification. Next, we have Joel Witt, who is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and the director of 38 North. He was also a former State Department official who helped to implement the 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework, as well as its implementation. Third, we have Dr. Lee Hae-jung, who is also a professor of political science and international relations at Chungang University. He's also an advisor for the Ministry of Unification, as well as for the Blue House, their Office of National Security. And then last, we have Jean Lee, who is the director of the Korea Center at the Wilson Center. She was the Korea bureau chief for the Associated Press from 2008 to 2013, and she also established the Pyongyang bureau for AP in 2012. So with that, let's go ahead and start with Dr. Lee to my left.
네, would you please wear devices? Yeah. I try to talk in English. In Korean, sorry.
The North Korean system continuously have asked in U.S. negotiations that the United States should show direct action, as North Korea shows direct action too. And also during the six-party talks, North Korea wanted the direct participation in a light water reaction work. And even now, in their denuclearization, they want the U.S. to take a specific action. And so in Hanoi, the North Korea said that with denuclearization, the U.S. Proposed that economic development assistance in exchange for denuclearization. But North Korea rejected this and said that this is what for South Korea to do, not directly the United States. And so this is related to confidence building. Even now, the United States, in terms of giving a direct compensation to North Korea, is not befitting for a superpower to do this. And in terms of North Korea, it is saying that it may not be fitting, but for negotiations to proceed, the United States needs to take direct action. And so the United States, in terms of United Nations sanctions, that at the end they said that they could help with sanctions reduction, and North Korea said that for each step that they take, they need to take corresponding economic sanction reduction. So they need to make a new system with every step. So in terms of North Korea, we don't think that there are many hopes for progress with talks between North Korea and the United States. So a lot of people are pessimistic. And Frank Holm asked about the prospects of next year. And if we continue in this way, I believe that North Korea will continue the red line that the U.S. and Korea has set. They may transgress that red line. And I think the biggest victims of that transgression will be South Korea. To avoid this situation, the South Korean government is hurriedly in talks with North Korea, with the United States, and also with North Korea. So there's a Korean saying that taking the first step is half of the progress, entire progress. So the Yongbyon should be dismantled, and the United States should accept this dismantlement first, and that this, in compensation for this, UN sanctions, at least one, could be relaxed. Or by relaxed, we don't mean simply suspending it. We mean that a new UN sanction will be created. It doesn't mean just the U.S. acting alone. And so creating a snapback clause that will help assist with the progress. So I'd like to say one more thing. Next year, the Tokyo Olympics will take place. And in 2017, fire and fury was threatened. We overcame this, and there was a relatively peaceful state in 2018. And before next year's Tokyo Olympics, I think that Korea, U.S., and Japan should get together and take trilateral measures to try to reduce tensions. And in 2021, there's also the Peking Olympics. And then I think that there should be negotiations. So there should be a truce every time there is an Olympics, and having this kind of periodic truce with different allies will contribute to reduction of tension.
Please bear with me. It's on. It's on? Okay, great. Let me get rid of this piece of electronics. Thanks, Frank. I really appreciate the invitation to talk here today. Since we only have 7 minutes, I'm just going to make 3 quick points. And I apologize if this overlaps with what other people have said. And I know some of you have heard me before give my spiel. So I always try to add something new, and hopefully I've done that this time around. First, yes, we're not in a good spot. And I would say that the chances are 80-20 that by the end of the year, the diplomacy is going to fail here. And I think it's been particularly obvious since what happened in Stockholm. My impression is the United States went into that meeting with a fairly flexible and forthcoming position, but the North Koreans were just there to ambush the Americans. They sat, they listened politely, and at the end of the session, they read their statement in private, and then they came out and read the statement in public. They came with the statement, the negative statement. So it's pretty obvious since then also that the North Koreans just aren't responding and they're not responding to attempts to restart engagement. And they've even trashed the Swedes in the process. The Swedes have been trying to be the intermediary in this process. Secondly, I say 80-20 because given my experience over the past 20 years with the North Koreans, you can never be sure what they're up to. I mean, it could be that we're already over the brink, the window is closed, or it could be that they're trying to squeeze more and more out of the United States and South Korea, more and more concessions. So I am willing to play out to see if that 20% is real or not. And so what I think what we need to do is to give diplomacy one last shot here. I know that Washington is trying to do that. The recent cancellation of the air exercise was certainly intended for that purpose. It was a step in the right direction. Our friends in South Korea have offered to give North Korea 50,000 tons of food aid through the WFP. That's been rejected. The U.S. initiative with the air exercise has been essentially rejected. So what I would say here, if we're focused on diplomacy, we're doing too little, too late. And that leads me to what I think needs to be done, which is administer shock treatment to this patient on its deathbed. And I think we need to seriously consider a proposal to suspend U.S. ROK exercises. All the exercises in the spring, whatever they are, reduced otherwise, we need to consider a proposal to suspend the exercises, number one. Number two, we should offer to the North Koreans the prospect of President Trump visiting Pyongyang, not what he's done before to just visit, meet, reach a statement that maybe has 3 phrases in it and go home, but to visit Pyongyang after U.S. and North Korean negotiators work out some details. We need to put more flesh on the bones. There's a lot of talk about what should we do in denuclearization talks. I've been through this a million times. When you're in the U.S. government, you know, you have guys sitting there working out roadmaps 24 hours a day. And once you get into the talks, the roadmaps often go out the window. But I'm going to make my own suggestions here, which is that in the nuclear discussions, I agree. I think getting rapid disablement of Yonbyon is a fine first step. I know a lot of Americans want to go beyond that. I don't think that's going to be possible in the beginning, and I'm fairly certain it won't be possible. And in return for that, yes, you know, we'll figure out sanctions lifting, what to do there. But the key here is rapid disablement, not dismantling Yonbyon over 10 years. Rapid disablement can happen in weeks, if not months. And there's a whole raft of other political and security measures that can be taken. Everyone knows what they are. They've been discussed in the meetings between Americans and North Koreans. I think they're not the problem. It's this central issue. Third, since this is only 20%, a 20% chance of success, we need to be prepared for failure. And quite frankly, right now, we aren't even close to being prepared for failure. And I'll just mention one thing. In order to be prepared for failure, we need a strong alliance. That's the bedrock of maximum pressure, if maximum pressure is possible, which I don't think it is. But in any case, that's the bedrock. And how can we have the bedrock ready if we're in the middle of this big dispute about cost sharing, which I think is going to be very corrosive. And on top of that, if the diplomacy fails and North Korea starts, I don't know how they'll, how the future will proceed, but there'll certainly maybe missile tests at the very least. Nuclear tests, I don't know, but that's going to generate pressures to beef up the alliance, to strengthen our capabilities in South Korea, like THAAD, or even, it's quite possible, although probably not the Moon administration, but it's possible there will be growing pressures to redeploy American nuclear weapons in South Korea. I think the combination of these trends is going to create great stress on the alliance. Certainly with the Moon administration, I don't know how it would react to if we wanted to beef up the missile defenses in South Korea, and also with whatever comes after the Moon administration. So these are going to be serious problems with the alliance that we're not even thinking about now. We need to look beyond the diplomacy with North Korea and try to look a little bit over the horizon to prepare for things if they don't work well. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Joel. I know people don't like to give predictions or be too prescriptive, so I appreciate that you're very specific in some of your recommendations. Professor Lee.
Yeah, apologies first. Term. I will not be specific. And I think we are at a critical juncture faced with changes whose scale is epic and structural and potentially transformative. And I'd like to just to give some observation on focusing on asymmetries and the relationship between North Korea and United States on the issue of the nuclearization. I think it's still the basic terms of deal is asymmetrical in the specific sense that North Korea had to abandon or give up their capabilities. And in return, they want sort of U.S. stopping abandonment of so-called, what they call, hostile policies. So it is a trade or deal between capabilities on the one hand and willingness on the other hand. So it is asymmetrical because United States, even if U.S. totally agree with North Korean demand that just abandonment of its hostile so-called hostile policy, United States had the capabilities to destroy North Korea. And second point, in terms of capabilities, the asymmetry on the one hand North Korea and on the other hand United States aligned with South Korea has been increasing because the Trump administration sort of doubled down on military capabilities, increase all the conventional and nuclear capabilities, and South Korea as well. So ironically, after a lot of engagement from the beginning of 2018, the asymmetry actually has been increased. And in terms of willingness from the part of the United States, I think there is a asymmetry or mismatch. On the one hand, the United States abandoned its deal with, for example, with Russia, intermediate nuclear forces agreement, and it just broke its deal with Iran. But on the other hand, it's the Trump administration's official position is we are willing to engage USIP in North Korea. So there is a big gap between America's sort of overall or global policy on the issue of denuclearization and U.S. policy toward North Korea. And last point on asymmetry between United States and North Korea. There has been a sort of complete reversal of American policy toward North Korea from the bottom up to top down. Everyone knows it. And there is a big asymmetry in terms of political capital and diplomatic efforts from North Korea's top-down effort to engage with United States. But the Trump administration, the top, Trump himself, is so much consumed with the other impeachment and all the problems. So there is a big gap on the top level in terms of their efforts coordinate everything else. So it is a sort of scholarly observation on the structural position and just very general comments what we should do. Number one, because this is a critical time point, we should sort of recognize the reality as it is. We should be present. And because this is a structural changes, we are faced with the structural changes, we should be practical, okay? And on the alliance issue and all those potentially transformative ramifications, I think we should be persistent and we should believe in democracy. The bottom line on the alliance issue is South Korea is a democracy, United States is a democracy, North Korea is not a democracy, China is not a democracy. So there is a huge gap between North and South Korea and China. Democracy is sort of our common bond. And how then alliance issue could be solved or resolved in a democratic way? That's a big challenge for us. That's it.
Thank you very much. And then Jean.
So what do I add to this discussion? I think I might build on what you discussed, what you alluded to, and perhaps put it in psychological terms. When we look at where we are in terms of the state of play between North Korea and the United States, I think I'm looking at it from a psychological dimension. You know, I'm just sitting here, when I was listening to the Unification Minister speak, I was thinking back to a year ago when we hosted the previous Unification Minister and the Korea Global Forum at the Wilson Center. 2018 was such a different beast. It was such a different year. What a difference a year makes. And you know, at that time, we were coming off of this sense of South Korea playing this integral role as a facilitator, playing this the President Moon playing this role in providing Kim Jong-un or the North Koreans with this international platform that the Pyeongchang Olympics offered, paving the way for him to step out diplomatically into the world and have that historic summit with Donald Trump. And I don't think that a year later, where we are now, is where anyone had expected us to be. And that includes the North Koreans. So when I put it into the larger context, I think Kim Jong-un is still trying to figure out what happened in Hanoi and still trying to figure out how to get these talks back on track. Right now, what we're seeing is Kim Jong-un, I think he's still interested in another summit with President Trump. And some sort of a deal. You mentioned the Tokyo Olympics, but I'm actually looking at the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, and that's because that's going to be in June of 2020, and that's because as a journalist who was on the ground in North Korea, we tend to look at everything from our calendar in the outside world. They have a different calendar that they're operating by, and if I were a North Korean bureaucrat, I would be looking according to that calendar and trying to figure out what steps we want to take to get to the point. So is that anniversary going to be a celebration of peace with the United States that Kim Jong-un can claim credit for? Or is it going to be a celebration of the hostility? I think that that's the question, that's the time frame I'm looking at. Right now, I think that what we're seeing is Steve Biegun's office trying to quietly behind the scenes entice the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. the President Trump, more publicly through his Twitter feed, trying to push those negotiations forward. I just want to mention, it was just Sunday that the Secretary of Defense postponed those drills. They used to be called Vigilant Ace. Those are drills that had been scaled back. Actually, Frank, please correct me if I'm wrong because you know this better than I do. Scaling them back was a concession. And while Secretary Esper may say, this is not a concession, I understand that he wants to silence critics who may criticize him for offering a concession. It is a concession. The Americans have to own it, and they have to make it clear with the North Koreans, we are giving you something big here, and you need to understand that in the transactional mode of operation or negotiation, you have to understand that this is a step we are taking. Now let's move forward. But the North Koreans, honestly, they don't have that much to work with. They don't have that many tools. They use access and they restrict access to them as a way to gain leverage. That's what they're doing with the South Koreans. By sidelining the South Koreans, they are trying to create that anxiety in South Korea, in Seoul, that they are this Korea passing phenomenon of not being included in discussions that have such a huge bearing on their future. And also trying to sow dissent, I think, even within the Trump administration. So it's not just about trying to create a divide within the alliance, but I think I also see some sowing of dissent within the Trump administration. So it was very interesting in the recent statements from high-level North Korean officials, in which a high-level North Korean official directly criticized President Trump. And so Kim Jong-un is getting his message and his displeasure out there without getting himself involved. So he's leaving a little bit of room for that personal diplomacy to perhaps come into play if the time is right. So really the North Koreans are trying to improve their position in whatever way they can so that when they sit down for those negotiations, they can be sure that they'll get more of what they want. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I'm trying to offset the pessimism on the panel. And I would say there are a couple other things that we need to watch out for. The sowing of dissent, the divide and conquer technique. I mean, I have to tell you, living and working in North Korea for 3 years, I had to do that every minute of my day in North Korea. Everything was a transaction. If I wanted to go to the bathroom, I had to negotiate. I mean, it really is a country where everyday life, not just at the political level, but in daily life, is dictated by your negotiation and by a transaction. So we need to understand that. And also using the divide and conquer technique. And so not only within the Trump administration and trying to prevent the North Koreans from doing what they did with, John Bolton, and even I think what they're trying to do with Secretary Pompeo. At the moment, Steve Biegun has been spared. Maybe they're waiting to see if they can utilize him successfully, but with the partners in the region as well. The best thing that the regional partners could do is to stand together, stand united, agree what it is they're trying to accomplish and how to get there. Just remember that Choi Sun-hee, Vice Foreign Minister, is in Moscow now, I believe, looking to perhaps convince the Russians not to send the North Korean workers back to North Korea. That deadline for the UN Security Council Resolution 2379 is coming up on December 22nd. By December 22nd, all UN member nations are asked to send North Korean workers back. So these are the kinds of things we need to watch. Are the North Koreans looking for other partners that they can go to try to divide the consensus on sanctions, to divide world opinion on how to think about denuclearization? So I just wanted to offer a little bit of that psychology based on my own experience in dealing with the very transactional nature of the North Koreans.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you to all of the panelists. We will now open it up for discussion and Q&A. And before we do that, I'll give you guys some time to think about the questions as I make one observation and ask the first question. So I think it's interesting that on one hand, you have North Korea that appears very hostile and reticent to return back to negotiations, whether it's working level or the leader level. But at the same time, so at face value, they seem hesitant. At the same time, they haven't completely dismiss returning back to negotiations. They haven't taken their ball back and went home. So they're making all these statements every day from different, the State Affairs Commission, different officials. So you get the sense that they actually do still value some sort of agreement, right? On the flip side is the United States, where the U.S. government has been saying every day, our shop is open, we're ready to play, we want to engage. They've been trying to message that point out consistently. So it seems like they want to engage. At the same time, they are willing to concede on many different points, except the one point that North Korea is interested in, sanctions relief. And so are they really interested in engaging if they're not willing to make a concession on the most important point that North Korea is asking for? So that's just the general observation I'll make. So my question to all of the panelists is, as we think about sort of this Venn diagram, the basket of things that North Korea wants, the basket of things that the US wants and values, is there an overlap? No matter how small, is there a sliver of an overlap where there is a basis for some sort of agreement that can be reached? I think Joel already outlined a lot of things that are sort of already on the table, but is there something that can be the basis for some sort of interim or small-term, near-term agreement? And anyone can take that question. Please.
네.
Yes, last year, together with Jean Lee, we had a KGF discussion. At that time, as Jean mentioned, the situation has changed greatly, and the negotiation positions have weakened somewhat. And a lot of that, I agree with, and I believe a lot of that has to do with military exercises. The Panmunjom June 13th discussions was where President Moon talked with Kim Jong-un for 30 minutes. And during 30 minutes, Kim Jong-un requested interruption of military exercises. At that time, President Trump wanted, North Korea says that President Trump gave them a positive reaction to that. So if you meet North Koreans, they say, well, President Trump said that you would stop military exercises. And that's because South Korea requested it. And why is it still continuing at this point? So from the Moon administration point of view, the USFK Forces Korea is very important. And so without military exercises, what use is it to have them there? And so that's why they conducted the August exercises. In any event, for a long time, North Korea has requested a interruption of military exercises for a long time. And so they are saying that South Korea allowed this to happen. South Korea started military exercises. They wanted to start military exercises again. So that's why they are saying they don't want to talk with South Korea at all. So the South Korean government knows that the military relations with U.S. is very important, and so they're faced with a lot of difficulties as they talk to the North Koreans. But the Vigilant Ace exercise was postponed, and so they are trying to get a momentum with North Korean talks. And as I mentioned, the truce of 2020 before the Tokyo Olympics will be an important time point as well. In this view, we interrupted the October Vigilant Ace exercises. Why aren't you willing to talk? Is the South Korean question to North Korea. And I believe that there's one issue that's important here. Secretary of Defense Esper said that he would interrupt military exercises. And at this very same day, North Korea declared that Esper secretary is a great man. And then 2 days later, there was a critique of North Korea with the UN human rights resolution. But at that time, Japan was excluded. They stepped away from this resolution. So North Korea is saying Japan was a country that submitted the human rights resolution. Why isn't the United States recusing itself as well? This itself is a hostile act. And so this is a criticism of the United States. So they agree with the interruption of military exercises, but 2 days later, why did you take another approach with the UN resolution? Is the North Korean point of view. But I think that with time, I think that North Korea will come back to the negotiating table. And as Frank said earlier, economic sanctions are important, but domestically, the North Koreans deem very important the U.S.-Korean military exercises. And so their nuclear tests and ICBM tests, if they suspend that, you should suspend military exercises. So suspension for suspension has been a premise of all North Korean negotiations. And so I think that they believe that that is very important. But when you go into the talks itself, they will talk about compensation for economic sanctions.
First, I don't see anything surprising here about North Korea's behavior. You know, the idea that they're trying to divide all of us and they're working with Russians, they're working with Chinese. This is what they've been doing for 30 years. So there's nothing surprising here, and I don't think anyone is surprised by that. What we need to do is to focus on the problem at hand. Second, the problem at hand is that both sides have made concessions. Gene is right. Canceling the air exercise, that's a concession. Scaling back our exercises over the past year, that's a concession. Let's not forget North Korea has made concessions. No long-range missile tests, no nuclear tests. We all forget about that. Most people sort of say, oh yeah, they did that, but so what? Well, if you know nuclear technology and missile technology, they were actually headed on a dangerous path before they suspended those tests, short of the new developments they were working on. Third, you asked about overlap. You know, there's overlap if both sides want to negotiate. There's lots of overlap here. But what's going on, if we're taking the best case scenario, is that the North Koreans are pushing us to what they think might be our bottom line for talks. And so, you know, we're starting to move in that direction. We did in Stockholm. We were very flexible on a lot of different important issues. And now after Stockholm, we're moving more with the air exercise. So if you're taking the charitable interpretation here, this may continue at least up until January, if not before. Then we'll sit down and talk. But if that's not what's going on, the window may have already closed. They may have decided we'll come back again when there's a new president or in President Trump's second term. And in the meantime, they are preparing for failure. That's why they're talking to Chinese and Russians and others. We're not preparing.
I can see that as well. I think some of at least a few of the Democratic candidates for the Democratic nomination that have expressed their North Korea policy, including a willingness to consider sanctions relief. And if North Korea is hearing that, then why wouldn't they consider that a viable option? Do either of you want to also
Just going to say one thing about, it makes me uncomfortable to even talk about potential sanctions relief in a public forum, because once we start debating it, then as you say, the North Koreans start paying attention, and that means the U.S. loses some bargaining strength. So I think we have to assume that perhaps the negotiators on the U.S. side are looking at all these options, but they're not going to be able to talk about it, and they shouldn't. Because once you start talking about it, you're losing some ground. So I just, let's hope that it's part of what's under consideration, with caveats that they need to see something happen on the North Korean side in return.
As sort of a quick follow-up on what both of gentlemen mentioned, I think the bottom line, the minimum level or area of overlap between United States and North Korea is Yongbyon plus double freeze. North Korea already offered Yongbyon, and United States demanded we need more than Yongbyon, Yongbyon plus ARPA. And North Korea demanded recently, it is questionable they actually moved the goalpost further apart or not. It is a point of contention. But anyway, they demanded for double freeze. So why United States offer a little bit more lengthened time horizon, not just this time, but there will be another round of joint military exercise in spring, summer, fall. So why not 1 year or just a half of next year? We will scale back, or we will just adjust military exercise in the spring. So why don't you come to the table? So Yongbyon, you guys already offered. We will take it. And we offered the concession, not just this time Air Force exercise, but in the spring military exercise. And we are going to talk about everything, parallel and simultaneous, including sanctions relief. So what about Yongbyon plus double freeze? No. Yongbyon plus double freeze plus ARPA. ARPA should be dealt with in the negotiation table. That's my position.
Fair enough. Okay, let's go to questions. We have basically 15 minutes or so, so that gives us time for a few questions. Let's go with the gentleman right in the middle with the glasses. Sorry, yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jong-Won Lee, PhD candidate from American University. My question is, there are certain North Korean skeptics who argue that even if there is a suspension for suspension deal, as Dr. Lee mentioned, suspending North Korea's nuclear experiments in exchange for suspending U.S. auto-K military exercise, they may be good for DPRK, they may be good for U.S., but it might actually be good for South Korea, since South Korea will still have to face North Korea as a nuclear country and lose some of those military readiness because of lack of exercise. So from South Korea's perspective, it's really suspension for suspension deal, small deal, really good for South Korea's interests? Is my question.
The question is whether a freeze for freeze or suspension for suspension, while it may be good for North Korea, U.S. interests, is it good for South Korea's interests because they would be the victims of the lack of military readiness?
Whenever you're making proposals, whenever a diplomat or a U.S. government makes a proposal, you have to evaluate the different possibilities, right? So yes, you're right. Suspending military exercises indefinitely which is not what I'm talking about, would be bad. Suspending it for 6 months, and then maybe if you get to sit down with the North Koreans, work out what that exactly means, work out exactly what the missile and nuclear test moratorium means, and then weighing that against what happens if this process falls apart. So you have to look at the different futures and come to a conclusion about what serves your interests. That's the point. I mean, we're not just making these proposals because they sound nice. You have to evaluate the impact on your interests and also things you might do to offset that impact.
And the degradation to military readiness is also bad for the U.S. military working in a combined fashion with the South Korean military. And one could also argue that it may be a positive for South Korea if that sort of freeze allows diplomacy to proceed, that allows inter-Korean cooperation to advance as well. So that may be a risk that they're worth taking.
Right.
We had a question over here, right there.
I'm Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Are we stupid enough to trade for Yongbyon when there's at least one and perhaps two other Yongbyons? Or is there a minimum trade where we get all the Yongbyons all at once? Or are we going to go for some silly face-saving thing where the above-ground 30-year-old technology is given up, but the underground technology, the brand new stuff, is left in place?
Joel, I think you already answered this sort of in your remarks, but the question is like, is Yongbyon good enough, or should we go for the entire program?
And I'm not stupid enough just to settle for Yongbyon. There's a reason why I say that. You are not going to get at those other facilities right away. That's a given. So, I accept what you're saying. You have to tell me what you would do to solve this problem. And the reason I'm saying that is because with all the experience I've had, there's no way you're going to have to do this in phases. That's all there is to it. That's the only way this will work. So, I accept what you're saying, that you think that's a waste of time. That's fine. Then you have to, I hope, think through the implications of what you're saying. What does that mean for the future of Northeast Asia? Does that mean Northeast Asia is going to go nuclear? If North Korea's nuclear weapons program proceeds uncontrolled, what are South Korea and Japan going to do? What are the implications of that for the U.S. ROK and U.S.-Japan alliance? I don't think it's good. So that's all I'm saying, is everyone can have their own view on how to proceed here, as long as, I would say, with the caveat that you think through the implications of what you're advocating.
I was just going to say one more thing. There's the diplomatic process, and there's also President Trump, and he could decide that that's enough for him to get the deal that he may want as a foreign policy victory in the run-up to his re-election. I shouldn't say that. I didn't say that during his re-election campaign. So I think we have to acknowledge that as well, that there's a diplomatic process, but there's also that wild card that President Trump himself poses.
Right there.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. Despite the anti-Russia and anti-China hysteria that we have in the U.S. and the press and the Congress and even some within the cabinet, Trump has stuck his ground that he wants to be friends with Putin and he wants to make a deal and be friends with China. So he prefers bilateral negotiations, but nonetheless, what do you all think about the actual positive role that Russia and China could or should play, and what do you think Trump is looking for from Russia and China on this?
The role of Russia and China and what the U.S. is looking for from them.
Well, if we focus on sort of structural changes at stake, I think ROC-US military alliance is faced with the competing imperatives. On the one hand, there is the imperative of readiness, but on the other hand, we are trapped in two wars. One is how to dismantling Korean War, and on the other hand, how to, at the shadow of a coming war or preventing war between the United States and China. So all these current problems are trapped in between these past, how to resolve the Korean War and how to deter or preventing very hostile relationship between the United States and China. So the ROC-US military alliance is faced with, on the one hand, have to sort of maintain huge gap in terms of military power, deter North Korea, but on the other hand, transform its role, not just deter North Korean current threat, but prepare the alliance for the future, the sort of a peaceful transition and building peaceful regime. So there is another multilateral imperative that sort of in that kind of building a new peace, we have to take into account of the legitimate security concerns of China and Russia and US sort of future scenarios. So it is very complicated process, and as Mr. Joel Witt emphasized, that we have to weigh in the different scenarios and different risks and different opportunities. So, well, it is an open question, but we have to prepare not just to deal with North Korea's immediate threat, but how to reconcile the competing imperatives of dismantling the Korean War and preparing for a prosperous Peninsula and Northeast Asia in the future.
I'll just say we have to recognize that each country has its own interests. Each country has its own complicated history or relationship with the other countries in the region. But I wanted to mention those UN Security Council resolutions from 2 years ago. It was an unusual opportunity or occasion when China and Russia signed on. It was very unusual. That sent especially China's involvement or signature sent a strong message to Pyongyang. So that's an example of when China and Russia do sign on to a US-led effort. But we'll see what happens. It's, that 2-year deadline is coming up. We'll see if North Korea succeeds in dividing that unity. Remember that we had Kim Jong-un in the wake of the failure at Hanoi, the breakdown of those talks, go to Vladivostok and invite Xi Jinping to Pyongyang. Did I get that right? I think I have that right. In each case, got a little bit from each of them, but didn't get exactly what he wanted, which was sanctions relief. And so those are small examples, or perhaps significant examples of China and Russia supporting this effort to bring North Korea to the negotiating table.
Any other thoughts on this question? Okay, just a few minutes left, so let's take, I think there's a question down here. Yes.
Diane Rennick, Congressional Research Service. So there's no appetite for sanctions relief on the Hill at all. And all the sanctions that the U.S. has in place are codified in law. So how do you go about getting sanctions relief?
유엔 제재 관련
When it comes to the UN sanctions, there were discussions in Stockholm, and the U.S. had indicated that coal and textiles, these products, export control may be moratoriumed for 3 years. I understand that a Japanese newspaper had indicated that these were some of the offers on the table made by the U.S. Side. And I understand Fox News had also indicated a similar news to be true. Now, sanctions really are dependent on the interpretation of the moratoriums or relief to be provided for these sanctions. But for the North Koreans, if you wanted to work with the interpretation only and not with the actual resolution or the law, they were not happy with that because it means the U.S. can dial it back anytime because it's a matter of interpretation. What the North Koreans have wanted was a new resolution to be passed through the UN. So a new resolution would indicate a different sanctioning regime, and such as a JCPOA snapback could be introduced. That's what the North Koreans wanted, I understand. So from the Hanoi meeting way back now, North Korea had indicated that snapback could be an option. That's what we hear from North Koreans. So that's what I'm saying, that this is an approach that could be accepted, but the U.S., they do not want to go through a new resolution because you need China and Russia to, again, sign on to these resolutions. Now, that's a difficulty because the U.S. may not in the future have the consent of Russia and China to sanction North Korea again. 짧게.
Diane, you know a lot more about sanctions than I do, so. But what I would say, if tomorrow through some magic that President Trump reached a deal with North Korea that started us down the road of denuclearization, and parts of it had to do with sanctions and part of it required action on the Hill, I doubt if there would be any Republicans up there who would say, nah, we're not going to do it. And I bet you a lot of Democrats would go along too, because it's my experience. When you go up to the Hill, you try to sell an agreement, they're sitting there saying, nah, this is no good. You say to them, well, gee, okay, we'll go back, but this could mean fire and fury again. They'll all back off.
And as you know well, I would just add that certainly there's no appetite for providing a relief related to the unilateral U.S. sanctions. In fact, it's a matter of law when sanctions relief is allowed. But I could see, something related to exemptions or waivers of multilateral UN sanctions based on the Security Council resolutions that the administration could go for. Congress might not be happy about it, but that would be a first start. Yeah. All right, let's just take one last question and then we'll wrap it up. Back there.
Thank you. I'm a master's student at American University. I have a question to Mr. Witt. So South Korean Navy is reviewing developing South Korea's own nuclear-powered submarine. And if diplomacy fails and North Korea increases the level of its threats, in terms of South Korea's missile defense capability, do you think that the U.S. will support such plan? And what is your opinion about the effectiveness of such plan?
Are you talking about a nuclear-powered attack submarine or a nuclear-powered submarine carrying missiles?
Carrying missiles.
Carrying missiles?
Yeah, in terms of defense.
Well, that has nothing to do with... Yes, okay. So it would give South Korea another basing mode for missiles to attack North Korea. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, really. I don't know what more to say about it, honestly. I mean, even North Korea's ballistic missile submarine, I mean, there's a lot of hype out there in the press about this one clunky 1960s submarine that you could probably hear leave port right now if it left port from here. So the thing is not survivable, carries 3 missiles, and wouldn't get very far out of port before it was sunk. So I don't know what to say about a South Korean ballistic missile submarine, really. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this first session. The next one starts around 3:10, so please use this opportunity for a restroom break if you need it. And thank me in joining me for applying the panelists. Thank you so much.
South Korea thinking of building a ballistic submarine? I've read that.
Frank, can you start? Thank you everyone for joining us. Korea Global Forum for Peace 2019 that is hosted by Sejong Institute and the USIP. So before I forget, I want to thank Frank for hosting us today. And I know it's very tiring in the afternoon to have a conference like this, but believe me that it's going to be like for him to speak like 5 a.m. in the morning because he just arrived yesterday. So it's not tiring, okay? So this session is about the current status and the prospect of peace economy on the Korean Peninsula. So we are going to discuss one of the areas that Minister Kim Yong-Chul mentioned in his speech. And before we begin, I have a quick advertisement. The Sejong Institute just published a book on North Korean economy, titled Demystifying the North Korean Economy. So I have like a couple copies. So if you are very active in the discussion, I'm going to give out to you. And you all know our prominent panelists. I'm going to be very brief introducing them. From my left, Dr. Kim Sang-gi, a friend of mine who's now advising Minister Kim Yong-Chul at the Ministry of Unification, and Professor Park Kyung-hye of University of British Columbia, and Dr. Hazel Smith at the Wilson Center, and we have Dr. Lee Young-eun of SK Research Institute for Specs Management. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Kim Sang-gi for his presentation.
Please use this interpretation device. I'm going to speak in Korean.
What I would like to say today is that the Korean government is proposing a peace economy, and so I'd like to explain that a little bit at this point. Some people say that the North Korean talks are at an impasse, and talking about economics is kind of too early, or it's too much in the future. But I don't think that way. I think the window of opportunity is open, and the negotiation deadline that North Korea suggested, the end of the year is still some time left, and I think that we still can make some progress before then. And if we use the opportunity effectively, then next year, I think, can be a different situation from this year. And of course, I think that we need to, our governments, both our governments and North Korea need to make efforts to make this happen. So as an introduction, I wanted to say that, but then I wanted to talk about what is peace, the economy, and what is it, and explain it a little bit. The reason why Korean government is proposing this is that the peace on the Korean Peninsula has been continuing, and prosperity has been deteriorating also. And if we look at the Korean economy also, we need a new motivation. And also North Korea is also focusing on its economy. But co-prosperity between North and South Korea is conditional upon denuclearization and establishment of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So that's the background that our government states as a premise for this Korean economy, peace economy. So what is it? It means that peace is becoming a basis, a fundamental base, and a means for solidifying the economy. So it will help create a vicious cycle. So based on peace, economic prosperation can be the instabilities of war and military tension can be reduced, and therefore economic cooperation and prosperity can increase. Trade and logistics and finance can be increased between North and South Korea. And so beyond the Korean Peninsula, we can continue this prosperity towards the continent and to the seas, and so prosperity will be expanded in this way. Also, through economic cooperation, peace can be solidified. Through economic cooperation, there will be a common ground, and so this can deter conflict between the two Koreas and create an environment for sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. So this is the peace economy core principle forwarded by the Korean government. And if we look historically, after the World War II, in Europe, there was the steel and coal co-op that was created, and it is similar to that situation. In this way, then what kind of tasks or visions does this peace economy have? The vision means that based on this economy, there is a basis for, based on peace, there's a basis for co-prosperity. And this co-prosperity will not only happen on the Korean Peninsula, but Northeast Asia will also be actively involved in this prosperity. So in other words, the Korean market will become one, and so the seas on the south and the continent on the north will be also tied as a regional arena for prosperity. So for this vision, what kind of tasks need to be conducted? First, peace has to be secured on the Korean Peninsula, and North and South Korea has to develop. And establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula, the former speakers already talked about denuclearization and reduction of military arms. This is all included and will lead to more interaction between North and South Korea and increased transactions and periodical meetings between governmental officials. Secondly, through economic cooperation, there can be a new economic environment on the Korean Peninsula. On the east, there would be energy and tourism belt. And so Kumgang Mountain and Wonsan and Kalma area, Masingyong ski resort, and Seorak Mountains, there'll be a special tourist area that can be established. On the west coast will be for trade and commerce, and there'll be a railroad that connects the two Koreas, and then will create a logistical network where conventional and new industries can be created. And the DMZ, Peace and Prosperity Belt, will be a part of this. And so that will be ecosystem and resources and DMZ economic special economic zone will be created. Thirdly, this will be expanded to the continent and the seas. To the north, there is Central Asia and Russia and China. And to the south, there's India and Southeast Asia. And there will be new policies towards the north and the south. And a common railroad project will be a main core of this initiative. And in implementing this new plan, what can we expect? I think we can talk about three things. First, the scale of the economy will be expanded, and there will be a new motivation for growth. If we look at the population, if we talk about North and South Korea together, there will be one market that is 80 million people. And so this will be a new market that is available for the industries. And also, North and South industries, if new opportunities are given, there will be new jobs created. And there can be new jobs created. And the overall level of the citizens' everyday life will be increased, enhanced. And slow growth can be overcome. The second thing we can expect is that through the continental and oceanic expansion, we can expand roads and infrastructure such as trains, especially connecting to the north, will be a north-south railroad that will lead to Eurasia and expand towards Eurasia. And along with roads and railroads, related industries will also develop. And tourism is one of these industries. And then finally, we can talk about one other expectation. Currently, Korea is continually in a state of military tension. I think you may have heard of Korea discount. There's less credit rating, and there's a lower ability to invest. So if we talk about peace economy, instead of Korea discount, we can talk about Korea premium. And so the increase in credit ranking, as well as a new creation of new jobs, will be possible, as well as new investments, activation of new investments, which will contribute to activation of the economy. So that's all I had.
Is it on? Okay. I first of all would like to echo my colleagues and say thank you to the Sejong Institute, to USIP, and to Frank in particular for inviting me today. It's a particular pleasure for me because I was a USIP fellow at the previous building in 2001, 2002, where I wrote one of my earlier books on North Korea, and it's great to be here. I'd only seen a model of it before, so I've never been in the building before, so thank you very much. I'll try to be brief, and I understand my mission is just to provide a few talking points, and it's been a long day, so maybe I'll just provide a few controversial talking points based on some of my research. The two questions I was given to respond to by Frank are what are the implications of the current state of diplomatic negotiations on South Korea's efforts to build a peace economy? And the second one, are there alternative ways to strengthen inter-Korean and regional economic cooperation, assuming little or no sanctions relief? So I'll try to stick to the brief. So in terms of the first question, the implications of the current state of diplomatic negotiations, I think the simple answer is that until some progress is made in US DPRK negotiations, US DPRK, all the rest of them notwithstanding, the South Korean government is not likely to go ahead with implementation of any economic strategy that involves any form of economic investment in the DPRK, despite all the very laudable aspirations for what could be done if there was peace. And this is because, and I want to argue this, that the South Korean government has adopted a very conservative interpretation of the UN sanctions regime. So, at the risk of repeating some of the things that were talked about in the earlier session, but to set the scene, because I was asked to talk about the peace economy in the context of the diplomatic relations, the diplomatic negotiations, if we can just recap, we had a Singapore agreement which set out the broad goals agreed by the US and the DPRK, the commitment to establish new US DPRK relations in accordance with the desire of the peoples for peace and prosperity, United States and DPRK join efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime, reaffirming of the Panmunjom Declaration, working toward DPRK committing to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and the commitment to recovering the POWMIA remains. So there is an agreed joint statement between the mission goal in terms of the US and the DPRK, which is certainly a step forward over the many, many years of negotiations that have taken place between the US and the DPRK. So the big question is the operationalization of those goals. Now, both sides are verbally committed to diplomacy, but the issue is whether this is a diplomacy in the classical sense, whereby both sides engage in step-by-step negotiating based on compromise and reciprocal concessions. The only time you don't do that is if you've overwhelmingly defeated your enemy in war, and then you can impose what you like on them. Or is it a question that these negotiations are simply a meeting place in order to restate maximalist positions? Now, this matters in terms of what can be achieved, and it's an open question and a talking point as far as I can see. The latest around, as we all know, was in Stockholm. DPRK ended the talks. The US was pretty positive about the fact that some things were discussed openly in the talks. We haven't got a public record of the whys and wherefores of what happened in the talks, but we know, and it was restated recently, that the policy of both the United Nations and the United States was that unless the DPRK agreed first to complete irreversible and verifiable nuclear disarmament, then no concessions can be made, whereas the policy of the DPRK is to demand security guarantees as a condition of disarmament, and in the short term, some sanctions concessions. I think that really means if those positions didn't change in Stockholm, irrespective of the fact that 8 hours discussion took place, that it's doubtful if we're going to see much progress in order for a peace economy discussion to go forward. The North Koreans are not going to spell out what they see as a final outcome, which is what was demanded, I understand, in the negotiations. They also see a further extrapolation of the Singapore Declaration in terms of broad goals, as for their perspective, as simply another expression of bad faith, which they argue was displayed in the Hanoi summit when they thought they were going to get an agreement, and then there was another demand put on the table. So one question is, given these two opposing sides, are there any steps that the DPRK could take that didn't include CIVD, which might generate a reciprocal concession in terms of sanctions relief from the United States? If the answer is no, we're probably not going to get very far. And I would ask, and again, in terms of the peace economy that we're talking about, these are long-term aspirational steps, but we also have to think about the peace economy here and now for the 25 million people of North Korea who live in a much poorer country than in South Korea, and for whom arguably it matters more that there's some form of economic support than from the population of South Korea. And this relates to the changing diplomatic environment for the North Korean negotiators. And in the same way that US negotiators have to take into account the changing environment, for instance, in the United States, the political environment, the changing environment in terms of allies, it's a mistake to think that DPRK negotiating imperatives always stay the same. For instance, in February 2019 in Hanoi, when the DPRK demanded the lifting of a number of the post-2016 sanctions, at that time, North Korea considered it was facing mass starvation later in the year, this year. And the reason for that was that the oil sanctions in particular had been in effect for a year, and the natural gas sanctions, and the effect of them had been to decimate North Korean agricultural production. And I can talk about that, why that is in a minute if anybody was interested in that. There are no domestic sources of oil in DPRK, so agriculture, as in every country in the world, is dependent on oil products, fertilizers, pesticides. If you don't have oil or natural gas, then you have a destroyed agricultural production, which is what happened in North Korea. In fact, the oil sanctions, the post-2016 oil sanctions, and we can go into detail about what they were, recreated the proximate causal conditions of the famine that took place in the 1990s. So the result of not just of oil sanctions, but a major causal effect was that the food deficit in 2018 was 1.5 million tons out of a total of about 5.5 million that's needed to feed the North Korean population, 25 million population. So a very large deficit compared to a normal deficit of about 500,000 in the previous years, which could have been filled through imports. But of course, if all your imports are banned, you don't have export income through which you can buy imports. So there were big incentives for the North Korea to come to some form of deal based around the lifting of oil sanctions. Not all oil sanctions, but back up to the September 2017 limit, for instance, which was reduced in December 2017. But those imperatives have changed now in terms of the negotiating environment, because Xi Jinping visited DPRK this year and guaranteed that there would be no starvation by giving 1 million tons of food aid to North Korea. And that meant that although the economy can't grow in North Korea, they've lifted the threat of starvation, which existed at the time of the Hanoi summit, is now lifted. The result of all that, in terms of the negotiating environment and then in terms of the likelihood for a peace economy, are that North Korea's trade is tiny anyway compared to world trade. So coal and textiles exports, which are banned, are tiny in world terms, and tiny in terms of China trade, which receives most of these exports. And arguably these can be circumvented by bilateral deals with Chinese provinces. The oil sanctions are unenforceable now because they're unrealistic. China's not going to allow North Korea a big starvation in North Korea similar to the 1990s anymore. And also what this means is that China, the North Korea has had to admit this year that it's wholly dependent not just on Chinese trade, but on Chinese assistance, not just for prosperity, but for simple survival of the population. And this changes the strategic balance in East Asia, because although the North Koreans hate dealing with the Chinese, they've had to accept that they are now completely dependent on China. And this gives China, along with Russia, a rather large negotiating clout. And it does mean that if China and Russia also come forward with a deal, which they argue partially comes up with a nuclear freeze over the next months or year, that they could put this to the Security Council. If the Security Council doesn't accept it, they could go ahead with it anyway, because North Korea is a Chinese and Russian neighbour. It's not a US neighbour, and it can manage to get along with trade, provided China and Russia support them. So coming back to the title, the practical ways to support projects by the South Korean government are perhaps to be a bit bolder in terms of the implementation of the projects that it's got on the table. There are no reasons why some of the development projects could not be marketed as humanitarian projects. There's no reasons why South Korea couldn't give lots and lots of scholarships overseas, in Indonesia, in Asia, in India, in China, for North Korean students to study abroad. there's no reason really not to implement the North Korean census, which has been developed with the UNFPA, and which South Korea promised to fund. It's about $29 million, but was stopped because it involved computers. The outcome of that census would give a transparent look into North Korean society. We'd all benefit from the information. We could compare it to the 2008 census. If North Korea goes ahead with it on its own, it won't be transparent. So there's lots of things that South Korea can do. But to go back to my premises, I think there's been, for very understandable reasons, a very conservative interpretation of the sanctions regime. So in the short term, perhaps as I was asked this question, I don't want to be impertinent in interfering in South Korea's decision-making. It's nothing really to do with me. I'm an observer. But I think that there is a possibility for some bolder interpretation, even given the current situation of what projects could be implemented, even within the sanctions regime.
Thank you, Hazel. Now I'm going to ask Professor Park Kyung-hee. And as most of you already knew that Professor Park is a frequent visitor of North Korea, and she's also has great lengths of experience in helping North Korea students study elsewhere. So please, Professor Park.
I don't. So on. Well, thank you. It's nice to be back to USIP. I was here in April and then see my colleagues from USIP and also my colleagues from Korea. It's great, and thanks for the invitation. As Hazel said, we were asked to address two questions or to answer the questions. What are the implications of current diplomatic negotiation on South Korea's peace economy, and what can we do to strengthen inter-Korean relations given the sanctions regime? Well, I guess the fundamental cause of the ongoing impasse between the two countries is that inter-Korean relations are subordinate to the U.S.-North Korea relations, and the absence of any agreement so far between U.S. and North Korea left South Korea struggling to define the next steps. Meanwhile, Pyongyang sees itself entering into the negotiation table from a position of strength, not position of weakness, because of its powerful deterrent to nuclear weapons, and at demanding the United States to stop hostile policy, to guarantee North Korea's right to survival and the right to development. So what are the implications on South Korea's peace economy then? Well, as we all know, President Moon in September at his UN speech, he says that South Korea intends to create peace economy, whereby peace can lead economic cooperation with North Korea, which in turn will reinforce peace, all working in a virtuous cycle. In principle, I think the peace development nexus makes good sense for the economy of both North and South Korea. The conventional wisdom on economic development and peace was that economic development was a precondition for security. But later, this argument was increasingly put into question because economic growth alone does not prevent conflict. So with the view that instability hinders development, many literature began to argue for conflict-sensitive economic cooperation and for strategic peace building as a factor to be considered in economic cooperation. So in this context, having peace building, conflict prevention, and reconciliation as objectives in designing the future inter-Korean economic cooperation makes a good sense to me. Also, I think the idea of peace economy could be appealing to North Korea. To Kim Jong-un, the issues of peace, issues of economy are not only issues for state security, but also issues for his own regime security. So any success in virtuous cycle of peace economy could consolidate his legitimacy. Well, in this situation, North Korea would welcome South Korea's peace economy building, perhaps starting with Mount Kumgang project and Kaesong industrial complex project. However, the problem is that South Korea, unfortunately, has not been able to deliver the virtuous cycle of peace economy yet due to deadlocked nuclear negotiations. So to Pyongyang, South Korea has strategic values only when it is capable of persuading the United States to ease sanctions, only when it is capable of creating the right conditions to implement inter-Korean economic cooperation. So currently, Trump touts North Korea's no missile test, no nuclear test as evidence of his big success in his bromance diplomacy. Unlike Trump, Kim Jong-un has nothing to claim. He does not have anything to have credit for, except the fact that Kim Jong-un has met with the President of the United States, which is not a big deal to North Koreans. In South Korea, in spite of political disputes, more than 60% of South Koreans support the reopening of Kaesong Industrial Complex and resuming Kumgang Mountain project. But as we all know, South Korea cannot do this, cannot deliver this because the UN sanctions prohibit transfer of bulk cash. So in this, the background, in October, Kim Jong-un ordered the destruction of South Korean facilities in Kumgang Mountain and announced North Korea's plan to build its own and said that there is no room for South Korea to cut in a quotation. That deals a major setback to South Korean government, unfortunately. However, I don't interpret this North Korean move as Pyongyang's intention to exclude completely South Korean investors and businesses. Rather, I think Pyongyang is expressing its frustration over the protracted suspension because the Kumgang Mountain was not developed, could not be developed in the last 10 years. Well, let me tell you a bit about the North Korea's love for tourism. Well, currently, as we all know, the tourism is one of the most important sources of hard currency. I went to Pyongyang a few times this year, and every time I found the Korea hotel where I'm staying full of tourists from China mainly, of course, but also from European countries. Sometimes it's hard to buy airline ticket to Pyongyang from Beijing. You see, one time I had to directly contact North Koreans and look, can you get me a ticket so that I could go? And the train ticket from Beijing to Pyongyang is impossible, buying train ticket, even for North Koreans, you see, because of all these tourists. Well, this time I went to Mount Chilbo, which is well known as Mount Kumgang of North Hamgyong province, right? From Pyongyang, you have to take a domestic flight to Orang. There are two flights a week. And Orang is about 3.5-hour drive from Chilbo. Well, when I went there, I asked the stewardess, how many seats do you have in this flight? Because it was packed, full. She said 150 seats, no seat at all, no empty seat. On our way back, we were even asked if we could take next flight meaning 3 days later, right? And we said, no way. Why? They probably overbooked. And they said they even offered, we'll refund you your airfare. And so we had to argue with them more than an hour to retain our seat in that plane. the Chilbo, although it is one of the 6 most beautiful mountains in North Korea, but not developed at all. No hotel, no paved road, no infra, nothing, only homestay. But I was surprised to see the tourists from China and also from Europe and also from Canada. The people people running the business there, they seem to be relatively well-to-do because they deal with cash all the time, right? And then every transaction was done in yuan, Chinese, yuan. And they said Chinese they come to Chilbo area all year round. So these North Koreans, they sell tourists mountain vegetables and seafood because like Keungang, Chilbo is surrounded by mountain and ocean. The woman who hosted us in her house, after work, she had her own laptop. After work, she turned on her laptop and watched the movie. And I asked her, what movie are you watching? She said, oh, Indian movie. Indian movie. And she was wearing a thermal, hair cap. And I asked, what is that? What are you wearing? She says, oh, this is for nourishing my hair. So thermal, nourishing hair cap every night. I've never used that in my whole life. And so, likewise, tourism is a booming business in North Korea. And the Keungang Mountain is the cream of the cream in their tourism business, right? And so 10 years of no progress frustrates North Korea. And this, in turn, threatens South Korea's efforts to build peace economy, I think. So, what do we need to do? I mean, I don't know what we need to do, but then he asked us to address this. So 3 things. One, as I said, inter-Korean economic cooperation heavily depends on the Washington's willingness to support the easing sanctions. I know Washington here, everybody, hear from my colleagues, everybody is gloomy about the picture, right? However, South Korean government might need to negotiate harder to obtain maximum flexibility. Somebody mentioned the snapshot, the snapback provision and all that. So certainly, although it is very difficult, I think at least the South Koreans give it a try. And secondly, Seoul might allow for South Korean companies might allow some room for South Korean companies to work directly or negotiate directly with North Korea if North Korea reaches out to them. So that, particularly for the Keungang Mountain tourism, so that they could be prepared for their future business with Pyongyang once sanctions are lifted. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think North Korea will completely exclude South Korean private businesses because they need not only investors, but also they need knowledge, expertise, and also experiences of South Korean companies in resort thematic and particularly ecotourism. The Kim Jong-un emphasized the ecotourism in Keungang Mountain. And third, as it was mentioned, as a person who's doing, trying to do the human capacity building in North Korea by inviting North Korean professors every year, 6 professors for their 6-month study at my university. I've been doing this for 9 years, so more than 50 people have come to my program, Knowledge Partnership Program. So as I think strategic peace building, for strategic peace building, South Korea might encourage and support capacity building program, as you mentioned. As Yuan Galtung says, peace building implies something more dynamic, something more positive than creating stability. And revolves around the notion of capacity building, good governance, and like that. And so enhancing human capacity building, by enhancing human capacity building, I think South Korea's peace economy nexus could be broadened and deepened. And these human capacity building programs could promote sustainable peace economy, particularly in conflict-affected countries like North and South Korea. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Park. Last but not least, we have Dr. Lee Young-eun, and I forgot to mention that he is the main contributor of this book, which I'm going to give away after the session. Dr. Lee, please.
Yes, nice to meet you all. The content of my presentation is about the recent changes in the North Korean economy and its effects. Why I want to explain this is that recently the changes in North Korea, not a lot of people know about this, and so I think we need to focus on this topic. First, the North Korean sanctions have begun in 2014, but in 2016, and the influence of these sanctions have not really been that severe. So if we do a comprehensive analysis, in 2018, about 8% inflation occurred in the North Korean economy. And if we go deeper, oil and petroleum was very fluctuating because they're very foreign dependent, but the others were quite stable. So despite our expectations, the sanctions influence was not that great. So why is this? This may be because the nuclear threats have increased, and we have seen the sanctions implemented, but we haven't really looked deep into the economy of the North Koreans. So what are the main changes? I'd like to focus on three main points. First is innovation, and second is the change in the path forward. First, the economic innovations have occurred, and they become systematized after a certain amount of time. It's not only affecting industries, but also affecting finance as well. So it's an overall change in the transformation in the Korean economy. And the second point, and this is very important, industries or co-op agricultures are given real power. In the past, the government did the planning and they did the selling and distribution, and the government was responsible for that. But now, the industries themselves are given the freedom to do that. And so they need to be responsible by themselves. And so as a result, the competition between the industries have become very high. So they want to sell something that will sell, and then after paying some of the profits to the government, they need to reinvest that into managing their industry. And so it becomes a brand industry. It used to be a monopoly system, but now it's more of a competitive economy industry. For example, in the smartphone industry, until last year, there were only 3 companies that were competing. But now there are 2 new companies that existed. So there are 5 cell phone companies that are competing for consumers. So this is not only mobile phones, it's cosmetics, it's TVs. Everything has changed to a competitive economy. And so the number of products, the quantity has increased, and qualitatively, the quality has also increased as well as diversification of products. This is a big change. And then in the past, in China and Vietnam, these are things we couldn't see in those countries. IT has been integrated so that the changes have been very large scale. And so e-commerce, for example, or credit use of electronic card systems has quickly taken place. So if we look at these changes, based on these, the domestic preference for domestic products has been taking place according to the pace of nuclear projects. So as nuclear projects begun, this trend has also increased as well. So consumers are looking for food domestically and other consumer products domestically. And so they are now substituting domestic products for Chinese products. So electronics such as smartphones, smart TV is developed within North Korea. And still, they may not have enough components, but they still have reached a certain amount of domestic manufacturing. And also, the military path has changed to an economic path. And so this is not just rhetoric, but on a practical sense, this is occurring. So military troops, for example, are being changed into a production facility, or troops are being input into production facilities, or military facilities, production facilities are changed to civilian production facilities. And as a result, even within the midst of economic sanctions, North Koreans still have a survival ability. In other words, even in the midst of economic sanctions, they can produce a supply that is stable. And these aspects are reflected in the everyday lives of North Koreans. And you can look at the specifics in this book. But what this tells us is the following. Even though the economic sanctions have strengthened, the North Korean economy is still able to be somewhat stable. And this has a policy kind of result that maybe the economic sanctions are not having the effects that we had originally thought. So they may be able to last longer than we had originally thought. And also, the stronger the sanctions, the more North Korea is dependent on China. And is this contributing to peace economy? These are some questions that come to mind.
The authority as a moderator that I have, and I'm going to ask a question to Hazel. That one of the sentences that stands out to me during your presentation is that Korean government is conservative in interpreting like sanctions. So could you elaborate more in what area you perceive that Korean government is conservative in interpreting UN sanctions?
Well, if I can just expand on one of the examples I already gave, the DPRK North Korea census has been planned for years now with the UN, UNFPA. All the plans are very well advanced. In 2008, the UNFPA also developed a census with the North Korean Central Bureau of Statistics. Because it was done in cooperative terms, it meant all the data became transparent and available to the international community. For those of you that haven't come across the 2008 census, it's available online. There's pages and pages and pages and pages of it. Now, it's fantastically useful information. It doesn't mean to say you have to use it to analyze it. For instance, one of the things it does is it tells us how many people are in different industries. Now, we know from other evidence that women particularly have to register in workplaces and then they go off to the market. So we know that they're not working there all the time. But it just tells us even that small thing about where women are supposed to work or where the composition of what the composition of the economy is. So providing you can analyse the information, and that's the same in any country. If you get information from any country, there's hundreds, thousands and thousands of data points. There is a census from '93, but that wasn't developed. That was done unilaterally by the North Koreans, and it wasn't done to international criteria. 2003, it was. In 2008. Now, for a couple of years, the UNFPA have been working with the same people, Central Bureau of Statistics, and the South Korean government was going to fund this. And it was quite a modest amount. 29 million is not a great deal for the South Korean government. And the South Korean government, or I don't know which agency of the government is involved in it, but some agency of the government, has decided to put it on hold because it involves computers, and that could be seen as a dual use. On no occasion has the South Korean government even put it to the sanctions panel that this would be useful for all of us, whether it's for defense, whether it's for humanitarian reasons, whether it's for development reasons, because we'd have all that information. Not only would we have the snapshot information for 2019, so it was done this year, but for the first time we could have proper comparisons back to 2008. So that's what I mean about not being bold. There's been no effort to do this because the South Korean government would be very concerned that it would be seen as problematic. However, when you've got a US president who is absolutely committed on one level to forms of engagement with North Korea, it's not like we had in the last years of the Obama administration when it was strategic patience and that there was a deliberate policy decision after the 2013 anyway, not to engage in any of these projects. It seems that there is a window of opportunity. It might still be closed, but there is a window of opportunity to put forward some of these projects. To be even bolder, I think there's an argument that could be made that the transport infrastructure project involving the railways, of course it will benefit South Korea in the end in terms of providing export opportunities, but it would also provide proper jobs for North Koreans in a transparent manner because there would have to be international oversight, which would respond to some of the poverty in the country, because although some people are making money, a lot of people, millions, are not, and they're still facing the potential starvation when you don't have a regular food supply. So, yes, some people are making money, others are not. So these arguments have to be made, even in the context of post-2016 sanctions. Of course, there are all the strategic issues, but just because the United States and South Korea, for instance, are in conflict about the future military relationship doesn't mean to say that the United States leadership or parts of it, given President Trump's commitment to wanting to push things forward, may not be amenable to an argument. Maybe they wouldn't be, but these arguments are not being made. So that's the question. The reason I raised this was the question I was given was what can be done given sanctions. And that was simply to elaborate on what I thought perhaps there's a space there that could be taken forward.
Thank you, Hazel. So, Sang-Gi, what's your thought on the Hazel's argument that Korean government is too conservative?
우리 한국 정부가 그 유엔 안보리 대북제
The Korean government, in its interpretation of the North Korean sanctions, I think that maybe the view was that it may be overly conservative. But I think that there's really no specific reason why we should be overly conservative, and I don't believe that that is mostly the case. But I think there may be some areas where there could be some changes. For example, some people may already know that North Korean economic sanctions are very specific and tight-knit. For example, laptops that Hazel discussed. So you cannot import laptops into North Korea. So these are very specific items. And so these sanctions themselves need to be confirmed as unrelated to building a military power of North Korea. And so there are some of those instances where there's kind of a gray area and it may be difficult. But the Korean government basically, in terms of North Korean sanctions, UN sanctions, are meeting those sanctions, are obeying those sanctions. And so other people may think from the outside that maybe the South Korean government is overly conservative in interpreting the UN sanctions. But that is actually not totally true.
From the floor that one of my friends is over there, and Dr. Jung Ji-young from Fudan University, who's now at Stimson Center. Since one of the elements that commonly mentioned by our panelists is China-DPRK relations, so I'm going to ask Professor Jung Ji-young to comment on China-DPRK relations and its impact on the peace economy. Could you give him the mic, please?
Thank you. I'll speak in Korean. I have lived in North Korea for a long time. And I have also been to China quite a bit, over 100 occasions. And as such, I think I can speak on the economic relationship between China and North Korea. We understand that the North Korean economy is affected by the sanctioning regime. But does that mean that North Korean economy is about to collapse? I don't believe so. However, U.S. really holds the key, as the North Koreans see, for reducing the sanctioning regime. And if the Americans are truly wanting and intending to have a better relationship with North Korea, the U.S. must show through its action the time is ripe. That's the way the North Koreans see the issue. As to whether North Koreans are really intent on giving up their nuclear capabilities, well, I don't believe North Koreans are really at that stage, because at this point, North Koreans do believe the nuclear capabilities are what sustains their regime, and to ward off any external threats such as the U.S. So the North Koreans have not made up their mind to give it up, but they can eventually, at some point, when they feel there is no need to rely on the nuclear capabilities to have a stable regime and security of the regime. And as to the economic development, the North Koreans are quite intent on that one, that they have made up their mind that economic development is what the regime would pursue as a priority, because the quality of life for the people of North Korea goes hand in hand with the legitimacy of the regime of North Korea under Chairman Kim, as have been spoken of quite a bit here today. Kim's method of ruling is somewhat different from his father, his predecessor. And as such, Kim Jong-un seems to think that it is very important for there to be an economic development in order for his regime to continue to have legitimacy in the eyes of his people. The role to be played by the Chinese, well, China is about the only country right now that North Korea is depending on economically, and be it certain type of crucial products coming in from China, or the hard currencies coming in through these tourisms and things like that. North Korea do want to open their market and their economy, but who could they turn to? I mean, the only country they have right now is China. And so out of necessity, North Korea is relying on China. And there have been in recent years even closer relationship between the two countries. However, as you know, sometimes in order for us to take two steps forward, one step back is necessary. 2019 had been a difficult year between South and North Korea, as I understand. Going forward, we have to rethink about where North Korea should be putting their dependence on. China has become an even more important player in North Korea's economy. But that also means the influence of China has grown, and through China, perhaps changes can be had in North Korea. But whether that is to the benefit of South Korea remains to be seen. Denuclearization is something that everybody around North Korea is pursuing, and China can obviously play a very important and crucial role in that regards.
Of time constraints, now I'm only getting 2 questions from the floor. If anyone wants to ask questions, on the back.
My name is Amy McEwen. I'm a financial analyst. If the travelers or the tourism that is coming from China are only from China, how would it affect if the Chinese economy were to go through a negative or recessionary period? How would that affect South Korea through the North Korean behavior with sanctions?
So we could barely hear you. Could you speak up a little bit?
Okay. No, if the Chinese were to enter into a recessionary period or go through an economic hardship, how would this affect South Korea and North Korea if the North Koreans are relying on tourism and if there are sanctions in place?
중국의 불황은 북한 경제에 영향.
Of course, there would be a negative effect to North Korean economy if China were to enter into a depression or a recession. However, as to the magnitude of effect, we have to consider because it would be limited to food aid and perhaps some petroleum, not as much of an effect because this would be a political concern, a political decision made by the Chinese. 중국이
whole of East Asia and probably the United States and the UK, I mean the UK in the universities, for example, depends on Chinese students now. So it's an important question and it has very, very big ramifications. Because North Korea is very small in relationship to China, then I guess it would depend upon Chinese strategic thinking about how important it was to subsidize North Korea to at least for it to end up with survival, which in economic terms would not be very much compared to China's ability to pay.
Thank you. One last question. No one? Oh, okay, over there.
네, 방금 질문하신 데 이어서.
I would like to have a follow-up on the question just now. Recession in China will have some effect on the psyche of the Chinese government in involving itself into North Korea. What do you think? Because even the influence that the Chinese want to exercise over North Korea will be affected by what happens domestically in China, right? I'm not sure if I can address maybe I'll take a stab at it. And as to North Korea, there would be some effect, but again, the magnitude would be limited because for North Korea, the support and aid from China are limited in the categories. One is in the area of petroleum, about 500,000 tons per year, it looks like, from China to North Korea. Before it was a refined petroleum, but now it's not refined ones. And also, I believe there were some coming in through Russia. And so if not China, the Russians will also provide the petroleums anyway. And then there's the food aid. On annual basis, North Korea is in deficit for about 500,000 tons also. And most of these are coming from China as an aid. But other than the food aid, there's some fertilizers coming from China. Especially when it comes to harvest seasons, you need these fertilizers. These are the aids that you get. There are also public works that China and North Korea engage in together. There are some public events that are held together between the two countries. However, as spoken of earlier, the domestication of and localization of many manufactured products in North Korea also means that there's less need and dependence on Chinese goods. So having said that, Kim Jong-un, in the beginning of his power, he had a lot of problems with China, and he was not happy with the Chinese government. We know that, and unhappiness has not actually gotten much better. And so the North Koreans, as a population, are not all that fond of the Chinese anyway. Now, having said that, the Chinese recession, whether that would have a direct effect and a large impact on the North Korean economy, I don't think so. I do not think the magnitude will be all that strong. It would just be limited, very limited. Since these are aids, perhaps they might be reduced a bit, but not a whole lot.
More than I did, right? Last comment for Hazel.
Yes, I'd like to expand on the response I gave earlier. I think one of the things that's important, it was a very important question actually, in terms of simple economic relationships, it all depends on what's happening, what the other variables are. Professor Chong's right in that up until last year, the deficit, the food deficit was about 500,000 tons. After the sanctions, the oil sanctions of 2017 and 2018, the food deficit in North Korea was 1.5 million tons. It jumped. This year, China's donated 1 million tons of food aid. That is an extraordinary amount. I mean, for those of you who don't deal with it, it's an extraordinary amount. One of the reasons they've been able to do it is that China is producing large grain surpluses. South Korea did this about 10 years ago under the Kim Dae-jung administration. It donated food aid, which was grain surpluses. It doesn't always happen that countries produce grain surpluses because they can change their agricultural policy so as not to do that. So there is a question as if those grain aid surpluses were not available in China this year. I think somebody might know but I think it's 3 or 4 million tons surplus, I'm not sure. Would that million tons of aid, if their agricultural deficit required it in North Korea, would China buy that from somewhere or supply it? So there is a question there, and that would depend upon a number of different variables. But the broader issue is what happens if China, and to a lesser extent Russia, fall out with North Korea politically, or if North Korea falls out with them, because as has been rightly pointed out, the North Koreans don't like being subservient to China. They give a hard time to the Chinese officials when they go in there every few months to talk to them. They disrespect them, they insult them, believe it or not, even though they depend more and more dependent on China. This is not a hypothetical question, because if we look back at 1991, 1992, it was the decision of China to start charging market prices for oil and oil products and other exports to North Korea, and the decision of the Soviet Union and then Russia to stop giving away fuel, particularly, and other goods to North Korea, which precipitated agricultural production losses and industrial collapse such that we had the famine from 93 to about 1998, what WFP characterizes as a famine in slow motion, but which the best research shows that nearly 1 million people died, this horrible term, extra deaths. Now, it wasn't the only cause, but it was the proximate cause, was the changes in policy by both China and Russia in terms of the provision of inputs which were necessary for agricultural production. So it's an important question because diplomatic relations don't stay the same. It's not always been that China and the former Soviet Union, then Russia, were amenable to supporting North Korea. And we can't be sure in the future that they would be amenable again, especially if North Korea has a nuclear test, because China will be furious if that happens, and we don't know what somebody might know here, but I don't know what their game plan is, but they will have one for if North Korea does a nuclear test, say in the spring.
Professor Park.
English. Well, I think as you mentioned, the area that hit most hard would be tourism, and as tourism is the most important sources of hard currency now, that could make North Korean economy in trouble. The second area is the student exchange. A lot of North Korean students are currently studying in China, and many North Korean students received PhD in China. Of course, they cannot take courses in science and technology area now because of sanctions, but at least in humanity and social science area, there are still many students. But I think overall, even if China has economic recession, I don't think China will completely abandon North Korea. Collapsing North Korea is a nightmare for China.
Thank you, Professor Park, and I would like to thank all the panelists for their fantastic presentation, and I also thank you, audience, for staying with us. So before I turn mic over to Frank for wrapping up, I would like to ask you to join me. Thank all our panelists today.
So I will shortly turn over to Dr. Baek Hak-sun, the president of Sejong Institute, to make closing remarks. Before I do that, again, I want to thank the Sejong Institute and the Ministry of Unification for collaborating with us on this event. I also want to thank my colleague Paul Lee, who helped us put this event together. It's very excellent work. So thank you so much, and Dr. Baek.
Ladies and gentlemen, it suddenly feels that it's just the beginning of the this conference. I feel it's just like a morning session. You know why? You know, in Seoul it is what time now? Maybe in the morning. Anyway, it's time to say goodbye, and I know what you're thinking of about my closing remarks. The sooner the shorter the better. But I'd like to make two quick observations. Number one, I hope Americans here in particular have to understand why Koreans are working so hard for peace on the Korean Peninsula. You might remember what happened in 2017. North Korea, test-fired, hydrogen bomb, and also, ICBM. They demonstrated ICBM capabilities, and there are, all kinds of discussions on how to respond by the Americans, and so military option and blood nose. But I think Americans have come to conclusion that the military option doesn't resolve the crisis. So they came to Singapore for diplomatic resolution. But more importantly, when there is, egregious heightened threat of war, not simple threat of war, the threat of a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula, toward the end of 2017 and the first and second day of 2018, Kim Jong-un said publicly, "I have a nuclear button on my desk in my office," and Donald Trump responded by twittering that I have much bigger and more powerful one, and it works. And so at that moment, we Koreans were really shocked and frustrated. Oh my gosh, political leaders are talking about nuclear weapons just like children's plaything. So enough is enough, never again. We have to deal with the fundamental root cause of the Korean problem. That was the instantaneously formed consensus among Koreans at that moment. I think that still is there among Koreans. I don't think it will go away. And so, we have tried to dismantle the Cold War structure and settle peace. That's what we are striving for. And we also wanted to, make a departure from our identity of so-called war and conflict. And we want to change our identity into that of peace. And then, person-to-person relationship, our way of thinking, our way of living, and all those things will change fundamentally. So I personally call it great transformation taking place in Korean Peninsula. I don't think, even though we negotiations, have stalled, and we have all kinds of, struggles, fight between so-called, the status quo forces and the revisionist forces within and between the countries involved, just like any big change in history. And but I don't think this will necessarily make us to say that the great transformation taking place in Korean Peninsula has come to an end. I don't think so. Geography does not change. We have to have a more longer perspective. That's the first point I wanted to make. And the other observation is this: all presentations and discussions, in my opinion, in a sense, have fallen within the purview of so what our priorities are, what our really top priorities are, and what really we are doing to achieve those priorities, to realize those priorities. I would say that our top priority is to denuclearize North Korea, the whole Korean Peninsula, and dismantle North Korea's ballistic missile ICBM capabilities. But North Koreans say would characterize this negotiation as a negotiation for bringing the United States, into their strategic design, where they could use America as a counterforce to China. Professor Jung is sitting there, but he may not like this. But that's something they are trying to achieve in the mind of North Korean leaders, as long as I try to figure it out. And also, this is a negotiation for ending the Korean War, signing a peace treaty, and normalize the relationship with the United States, and economically cooperative between the two, and so that they could come out into the world and survive and develop, so-called, for the 21st century. So, and also, this is commonsensical thing, but I would just say that this negotiation, this whole negotiation is designed for denuclearizing North Korea, to dismantle in North Korea's ballistic missile capabilities, particularly that of ICBM. Not American, not to denuclearize America, not to dismantle America's ballistic missile capabilities. And then I feel, honestly enough, as a North Korea watcher and as a scholar who tried to deal with this nuclear issue and ballistic missile issue and all these security issues, I would say Americans can do more in order to prevent North Korea from, ultimately developing nuclear-tipped ICBM capabilities. That's something I want to say to all of you. Thank you so much, and Frank and USIP, our co-host institution, and thank you for the not for the Ministry, Unification Ministry of the Republic of Korea, and all the panelists and audience, particularly the panelists who came across the Pacific, Chairman Beck and other panelists, and also Americans, participants and panelists and audience who came across the town. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope, Frank, we will continue our cooperation between our two institutions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again at the next event.